It's Radio Free Golgotha!
Yay!
Yay!
Yay! Um, so much has happened since we recorded our last episode.
Mm, yes, indeed. New year, new
New year,
times, same winter. Yeah.
same winter of our discontent. Um, Hello, everyone, and a very lovely, happy feast of the Chair of Saint Peter, which is our episode for today. This is episode 44 of Radio Free Golgotha. If this is your first time joining us, welcome. Yeah, yeah.
Hiya!
Hi. You can find more us about this grammar I am butchering at radiofreegolgotha.com and as well as our other exploits. And you can now join us on Patreon to get behind the scenes and extensive footnotes and blah blah blahs of goodies and brain explosions and marriage proposals and death threats, as it were. Um,
Friends and enemies, one and all, welcome, welcome, welcome. Yeah,
yes.
exactly. I'm really enjoying the red threads we set up on the Patreon actually of like here are things that are inspired by things we've talked about in episodes, but also
Yeah.
allow us to go down some glorious rabbit holes
Yeah.
and Pepe Silva out a little bit, occult speakingly. Um,
Yeah.
it's been really
I
fun.
am a big fan of the allowance for music and video and other media that allows of like this reminds me of blah blah blah. Yes, and I did get a private email about why red thread, and it's just a reference to the labyrinth and the red threads we met along the way. So yes, welcome to episode 44, Radio Free Golgotha. I am Jesse. This is Al.
Hiya.
Um, Otherwise known as a certain goat and the good doctor. We are commemorating, celebrating, honoring the feast of the Chair of Saint Peter, the more modern date, the second of two feasts, but the more modern universal date as such. And we have a lovely lineup of Sesame Streeted topics. I think it sounds better in your accent, Al. You read.
We have a lovely array of Sesame Street topics as our usual little hopscotch along a variety of occult topics, some of which we can see as we put them together. Oh, that might bring up some of the similar themes and motifs and stuff as others, and some of them we are making up as we go along. Hopefully, not the information itself, but musing on the connections between, I should say. Only PG, not UPG necessarily, except in some contexts when we will clearly label it as such. Shout out to Professor Portfield's idea to set up a verification board of Gnosis. So today we are celebrating the Feast of the Chair of St. Peter, the Feast of the Chair of St. Peter at Antioch specifically. If we want to go that way, we'll talk about what that means. We are also investigating, putting in the hot seat, the demon Trimasael or Irmasil sometimes, and their sometimes counterparted Exu of Quimbanda, Seu Pimenta. We're also talking about the herb of Storax, and presumably getting into some of the things that are called but are not Storax. We're talking about the mineral cinnabar. We're talking about the beast, the wolf. We're talking about planetary hours for our style of magic. We're talking a little bit about Laetitia for our geomantic figure, and its correspondingly or morphologically similar Odu of Ifa and Dilgun Obara. And we are continuing to get into the aces of the tarot. We're talking about the Ace of Cups this time. We're talking about the day sign of Quetzalcoatl. If I'm and I will
Excellent.
happily. Yeah, that was an alright pronunciation.
Yeah, that was good.
Hey, we'll maybe instigate some kind of Mesoamerican calendrical pronunciation drinking game. I don't know if it's better to do when I do or don't get it right, but we'll much on the lizard, and we'll talk about Tonali and Tresena in those terms. And our dead magician is Arthur Gauntlet, which I'm very excited to get into. Not only his grimoire, but also working with his ghost a little bit.
I'm surprised we haven't come up with B. Arthur Gauntlet as a viable.
The Golden Temperament girls. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Hero theory is everywhere.
As a complete aside, Al and I have a growing list of members of the House of Babylon, which is a fictional drag house of both drag of all genders. But its main premise is outrageous names that are stock characters that anyone can say, adopt the makeup patterns and mannerisms of said names and therefore rain chaos upon the world as needed.
Tanita
So,
Delphart, yeah.
yeah, yeah. There were a few here the other night that were fantastic, but I'll keep them private for now, lest we invite too many people to our feast. This is an interesting feast. I've wanted to do the Chair of St. Peter for a while because I think it's a strange. I mean, just like the Feast of the Ass, right? We
Mm.
went from ass to something the ass sits on,
Hmm.
and there's a theme apparently. It's butts. If that the theme is butts, um, which or the asses of current political intrigue apparently. So the Chair of St. Peter is a commemoration specifically of the physical throne of Saint Peter, or the chair, the cathedra of the ex cathedra, and there is in fact a relic of this thing that is said to be belong to Saint Peter as the first pope, and it's most famously known for its 17th century kind of encasing in a gilt bronze casing
Hmm.
by Bernini. So in the 1650-ish era, and the chair is described as by Pope Palpatine as a symbol of the special mission of Peter and his successors to tend Christ's flocks, keeping it united in faith and in charity. It has been jokingly called Peter's toilet, the ass of the Catholic Church, all these other things. But there's a lot of things that come out of this just symbolically that's there. And it was in my obsession of, I think I've wanted this for maybe 2 or 3 years to try and capture this feast day. But it's interesting because it was actually on display last year for the first time shown in public from since the 19th century.
Oh, damn.
So Francis showed it, I believe, on the 27th. And then of October, and then pulled it back in on the 26th. It was originally going to be there until the Immaculate Conception on the 8th, but things changed. But and having seen recent videos of that guy jumping on the altar in St. Peter's and throwing the candlesticks down and getting upset, like, I mean, sure, we all get upset at the opulence. At least we should get upset at some of this opulence, but it's a very strange thing to go into this spot and think that it's just, I don't know. That's not my spectacle there. But if I were to build an inflatable version of the same thing outside and do a whole bunch of, like, orgiastic displays of my opinions of the papacy and the upper classes, or a democracy, or anything that is supportive of upper classes of religious people, just for the fuck of it. Let's not talk about my performance past. Anyway, um, I
I
am
like that
so
very much.
lucky. I like that I had my entire performance art career before Facebook was invented. Um, so thank God for my 20s being when they were. So yeah, so there's this seat, right? It's an oak chair damaged by worms and other things that are there.
Mm.
It has the kind of metal rings on the side. It's a very uh, specific design, but Bernini is also augmenting this and kind of playing off of it. So there's a large thing going on there. There's no earthly counterpart, as it's said in contemporary furnishings to do what Bernini did. It
Right.
has like a weird upholstery pattern made in metal, and there's some large angels on there that are lovely, but the relic is encased within. And in the way of many Catholic things, I'm sure there's documents of what it actually looks like in there, but also at the same time, it's kind of like when they say that the saint is inviolate and is a myroblite or is incorruptible, and then you look at it like that's all wax. That's wax. That's not skin. And they're like, oh, to preserve it from the corruption of people taking, it's oftentimes it is to
Hmm.
protect relics. There is that thought of, walking off with a giant bronze or gilt gold thing, is its own uh, theft prevention. But yeah, so there's this lovely chair that says in Latin, O pastor ecclesia tu omnes Christi passis agnos et oves. O shepherd of the church, you feed all Christ's lambs and sheep. but no goats, sadly. And then it says the same thing in Greek as well. But yeah, it's the symbolic authority of the the vicar of Christ, the vicar of Rome, right? This is the bishop of Rome. So this is we've talked before about like the importance that the church places upon the historical um, passing the baton and apostolic succession from Saint Peter, because if you emphasize that, it means that there's a claim to earthly authority and a centralized authority, as opposed to like interestingly Peter, who never met Christ. Excuse me, Paul, who never met Christ.
Yeah.
That just changed the whole story right there. Of but of like, and ironically, Paul is actually a much more Gnostic figure in that way of like only having met the Spirit of Christ, but sure had some strong opinions about how we
Hmm.
should all behave. And that Peter and Paul are kind of the vision of Paul is kind of brought into the solid rock shoulders, the kind of Plato, if you will, of the Catholic Church, of this succession of that verse of "You are the rock upon whom I shall build my church," and memories of Biblet in ninth grade being told like this is an insult. He was
He's
saying
calling
you
him a
don't get
blockhead,
things.
right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
you don't get things. You're taking everything very literally, and I need you to loosen up.
Yeah.
Um,
And it's
but
that rock that this is the rock of the rock, right?
yes,
I was reading Palpatine Benedict says in what is it? Holiness is always in season, which is a great title for a book. So what was the chair of Saint Peter chosen by Christ as the rock on which to build the church? So it's a like if Peter is the rock, this is the rock that the rock sits on. Um,
yes,
Not Dwayne
um,
Johnson this time.
yeah, not Maui. So this is, I mean, the chair is it's an interesting one because in as far as relics go, this is a second class relic. It's not a part of the saint,
Mm.
but it is one of the biggest, if not the main feast for something that's a second class relic of this form.
Right,
So
and
there
it's kind of got
was
a special place in that sense, in that it's not just a relic of a saint who was into Christ, like you said, in spirit or in vision later, but like is meant to have been a thing established around the time that that Peter is establishing the church itself. So it's got
yes,
a particular proximity in at least a couple decades to the Nazarene himself as well, right?
yes,
Um, and
yeah,
like yeah, and like you said, I think I read a thing saying that the when they did some repairs on the chair itself, as opposed to the matryoshka reliquary that is shaped like a chair around it, just like the arm bone of a saint is sometimes kept in a thing that also looks like a big arm or gauntlet or
yes,
something. That the oldest parts are apparently from the 6th century, which is interesting. And again, there's a bit of a like reliquary of Tiresias thing, right? Oh well, we had to repair it along the way. But it's definitely said that the feast itself is celebrated from at least the 4th century,
yes,
and you've got like Saint Jerome writing about it. That there's a letter to Pope Damasus the First where he talks about again. I know that this is the rock on which the church has been built. He also talks about like consulting the chair of Saint Peter as well, where that faith is found exalted in the lips of an apostle, and about where he got his robes of Christ and so on. So it's
yeah,
definitely older than the 6th. So the practice of venerating the chair or the chair is older than the 6th century, and then in 875 it's gifted to Pope John the Eighth by Charles the Bald. I always wonder if he liked that nickname. And then it gets unveiled a little bit more at various points. So it's it. I was just trying to trace like some of the timeline here. We certainly know in the 9th century in the Martyrologium Hieronium that there's a February 22nd feast, which is said to be reflecting St. Peter's time in Antioch. And that the other
yeah,
feast, which is the 18th of January, celebrates his stay in Rome, which was after Antioch. So we know in around 34, or it is said that
yes,
in around 34 Common Era, Peter goes to Antioch. This is a major metropolitan city even by then, has this diverse population. It's been previously evangelized by Barnabas and Paul, and it's there, according to Acts, that Jesus' disciples are first called Christians.
Yes.
And Peter's there for like a good 7 years and like establishes this not just the physical seat but the seat of governance, and then later goes to Rome as well. I did read an interesting thing again in trying to trace the timeline on this a bit later, that one of the Lutheran or wider Protestant attempts to disavow the Pope's legitimacy is was to say in the 16th century that that Peter never went to Rome, and thus there can't be a bishop of Rome, and thus like the Pope is not the vicar of Christ.
Uh,
And so, in their opinion, there can be no Pope claimed by Catholics or anyone else for that matter. And it's specifically said to be in rejecting this Protestant challenge that Pope Paul IV, around the mid 16th century, reinstates the feast of the Chair of Peter in Rome, specifically in 1558. And then if we skip ahead, I got conflicting reports. Some say the calendric reform starts in 1960, might be as late as 62, but Pope John the 23rd gets rid of the January 18th feasts from the general Roman calendar, along
yeah.
with a bunch of other feast days that were duplicate feasts of a single saint or mystery, and they kind of cohere on this day, the February 22nd. And there is a little bit of a split at various points of honouring the first one, the 18th of January, as the chair of St. Peter in Rome, because even though it happens later, it's more important, obviously, especially for the Roman Catholic Church, and that the February 22nd is the seat that is the chair of St. Peter in Antioch. But those
Yeah.
kind of are conflated, and then this becomes our central one that kind of venerates both. And again,
Yeah.
signifies that episcopal office, right?
Yes.
Of the Pope
I
as
mean, you
Bishop
have
of Rome.
the greater tradition of cathedra in general, right? So like one of the things that I've literally been asked when attending masses with non-Catholic friends, I think high prots generally do this. I'm not sure, honestly. I know the tradition carries out into some low prot denominations, but the empty chair that is there, that is like, is it, is it for Elijah? No, it is in fact it is the office of the church. That is what that represents. So the bishop of your local area has a throne that is sat upon only by the bishop when they are visiting the church.
Right.
And this is by extension, because a bishop is named, in this apostolic succession, is the bishop has the ability to make new Christians through chrism and convert converts and things like this. There's a greater responsibility and authority granted to bishops. Priests don't make other priests; bishops make priests. But the
Mm.
bishop is also a priest. Is just this added layer where cathedra is where we get the term cathedral, right? So this is the seat of a bishop, ideally. This is what
Yeah.
a cathedral is, and therefore has the throne of the bishop that is most sat in. Um, and then from that way, it would be right to compare the cathedra, the tradition of this bishop's throne, almost to like a Qibla type of thing, because this represents the authority of Rome,
Mm.
in within the Catholic Church specifically, obviously, and by extension becomes this thing of like this is the place where authority sits. And we even in Catholicism have like the papal bulls that come out if something is infallible, it's a new doctrine or a clarification on existing doctrine. It is said to be ex cathedra, from the seat of the from the throne of the
Mm.
bishop.
Mm.
So this term of ex cathedra is a way to say this is directly from the Pope. This is infallible doctrine. And so EC, as it were, within the abbreviations of those of us that had to go to Catholic study. I do love this idea of a throne or a seat, and the kind of the relationship between metaphor and metonym always makes me excited, because it's also the basis of how Fraser looked at magic, right? Of sympathy, contagion, and things like this.
Mm.
And metonym itself here being that the chair stands in for Peter, and the recent archaeology around this too. And uh, I I am interested constantly in and allow for the mythic retelling of normal, quote unquote, everyday things.
Right.
I was just musing on this with a teacher the other day about how the Buddha's sitting under the Bodhi tree is often depicted as like 8 stations of the night, when we know that it was probably weeks or maybe even months that he was there.
Mm.
But it helps really to kind of condense it and make it seem really amazing that he achieved enlightenment under this tree that was being worshipped as a yaksha, as a spirit, on its own right. But there's something there that's interesting when we find out the extraordinary, or the side of it, that if Peter wasn't in Rome, but it's described in the Acts of the Apostles, I think, to the sequel, that an angel lets him out of prison, and there's only one prison in Rome, right? Like the Mamertine prison is the prison he would have been in with Peter, with Paul, excuse me. Apparently, I can't separate them, and I am at the age in my life where I will say everybody's name to try and find the name that the person is in front of me. But there was just this thing of, I think, in the back of the Vatican there is a marker for the cell of Peter or something, because you could see the obelisk or something. There's something weird. There's some really lovely markers around Vatican City, and the kind of, I think the thing that those of us that grow up in the New World, with Catholicism being so imported from a foreign land, Rome, like we've discussed with other things, kind of becomes its own mythic construct.
Yeah.
And similarly, like, Kent or Wales being Sephiroth to American Wiccans, it becomes a thing of like, there are actual historical markers of the city of Rome, and we actually know quite a bit of it. And Rome's contribution to even discussing city architecture is a whole other wonderful worm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but I am somehow, I really love the idea of this. A feast is a second class celebration, as it is anyway, within the way the church goes about things. And the rank of this is a feast rank. It's not a solemnity, but it is secondary liturgical days. So a second class relic, with a second class celebration, but still really important for the symbolic authority of the church, or therefore perhaps the ability of anyone, if we want to take the kind of seizing of power of that, of the ability of anyone to speak on behalf of God.
Mm.
And so I think that there is some type of heretical power, always, yes, to understanding what the seat of your power is. I don't want to get too new agey, but at the same time, there's a lot there. Speaking of new agey, my dad gave me the Castaneda books when I was like 10 to read, right? So
Mm.
like, I knew they were controversial as a teenager, but didn't quite know how fucked up that whole community became in time. If you want to look into the death of the women around him and everything, that's a whole other thing, or whether or not he's from Brazil or not. But the idea that, I think it's in the second book, maybe it's in the first, it's been a while, of finding your place in the room, that there's a place in every room that will deplete your power, and a place that will agree with your power.
Mm.
And it's lovely to tell a 10-year-old this, right? Because I'm going to find, the place on the roof at my grandmother's, and be like walking around the silos and the cattle guards and everything, and just be like, okay, this place on the tin roof, this is where my power is, because it just was
Mm.
cool to climb things. But by extension here, that is it just anybody who sits on the seat? No, it's not the object itself. It is the token of the object, the office of the object, the noose of the object,
Mm.
that is extending here, some um, through the contagion with Christ, right? This laying of hands on, and the spoken, recorded, convenient, recorded exaltation of Peter as authority. That gives back the historical precedence that this chair itself is symbolic of the authority of Jesus on earth, in the new, as we prepare to usher in the New Jerusalem, which it sure feels like we're heralding towards, and that's probably what the whole point of half this shit is that's going on politically. And the witch in me is like, okay, do like the rapture is not. I'm a Catholic by birth. The rapture is not biblically supported, but I really hope it's true, and a lot of these people go away very soon. Um, um,
Fair,
yeah,
fair, yeah,
yeah,
yeah, yeah. I like that musing very much, right? That yes, this is from a ecclesiastical hierarchy and like theological position. Yeah, this is how the church reiterates its authority given to Peter by Jesus, as recorded in the Gospel of Matthew about and this being handed down to Peter's successors for the past 2,000 years, right? And so, yeah,
yeah.
it's about apostolic succession in respect to the Pope and the bishops and everyone under them. I was reading a Catholic blog that was talking about, what it means to that particular person and what it can mean for people who aren't bishops, and talking about how we can think of the first cathedral as the upper room where Jesus gathers the disciples for
Uh-huh.
the Last Supper, and that along with the BVM receives the gift of the Holy Spirit. So it's
Hmm.
that chair is itself in that place in Rome is itself a stand-in for the chairs around the table of the Last Supper as well.
Oh, and certainly the notion that the first throne that Jesus sat in was his mother. We
Mm,
see look at the iconography, right, in the statues that Jesus is using the 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 lap of his mother as the throne from which he reigns, which of course then is an extension towards the authority over the physical universe that Mary's body is symbolically taking the place of, that she is everything,
yeah.
the of materiality, and the overlap with the Gnostic Sophia and everything that goes there. I can hear the again more Catholic school in my head of like the word overshadowed, and how the word overshadowed is used for God dwelling over the Ark of the Covenant, and then it was used again to describe the Holy Spirit over Mary. She's
Mm,
overshadowed the same way, that this is the new Ark, right? The new covenant, the New Testament, literally.
mm,
And that is part of it, that Mary is the Ark, the throne, and uh, co-redemptrix, whether or not current politics of Rome or otherwise agree with that. There's certainly a lot of really lovely historical research has been done into that, as far as the early church did not emphasize Mary, but by the ninth century she's in full force, and is that's we don't go back after that. That Jesus is almost much more androgynous in the first few centuries, and is mixed with kind of an Apollonian kind of hyper masculinity that's also hyper feminine.
yeah.
And then you get like the Gospel of Thomas of like there is no male, there is no female, going in, and this type of thing. So it's and then that merges eventually, where Jesus gets depicted with a beard more strongly the minute we can start to have Mary as the contrast. So
Mm,
something happened interesting gender wise, in the expression of religious iconography art, and the need to use this to rule, to emit the ex cathedra little rays and spirelli that make us experience the grace of God.
yeah.
Heavy umbrella for dripping sarcasm. Um, just in
Yeah.
case, dear first-time listener, you think that I am a strong adherent to the Catholic Church, like most people who are raised Hispanic Catholic, I have a love-hate with everything, including myself. So, Catholic may be the universe, but my God, everything exists within it that is wonderfully scratching at the iron of the vault of heaven. Anyway, um, speaking of little things clawing at the vault of heaven,
Mm,
um, because I feel like that's a pretty good, fun dip into the chair of St. Peter. We can always come back to it too.
yeah.
But little demonic nails, scratching, from the outside, from the underside, from the giant gyroscope bicycle Mad Max uh, orb that is our world, the Thunderdome. Uh, so it was interesting because I had originally proposed Marcosius
Hmm.
as a demon for today, simply because truth be told, the wolf and associations with February and the wolf month and things like this.
Mm.
And you're like, ah, you know, excuse me, you didn't cough. That wasn't a commentary. But oh, maybe we could do a Verum demon we haven't done yet. And it was like, okay. And Trimasael comes up. I'm saying that wrong, I'm sure. Um, and then you go through Jake's notes, and lo and behold, it is assigned or believed to be of the same demonic ilk as Marcosius.
Yes.
Um, so I feel like I was justified in my random just pick a wolf demon.
Yeah.
But I'm also curious if you have uncovered more wolf symbolism within Trimaciel's or Pimenta, I guess, kind of with Dasmata's influence there. But
Mm.
anyway, I've opened the portal to hell and cede it over to you because I will not pretend to be an expert in the Verum, but I will be pretend to be no, I won't have to pretend. I will endeavor to listen to your authority because yes, speak
Love a hell
authority.
portal. Love a hell portal. Especially if a hell
Yes.
portal opened by someone else, because cinematic rules dictate that the person who opened it is usually the first one eaten by the tentacles out of it.
And
Yeah, so
frankly, where would Buffy be without other people opening hell portals? So
right, creating jobs, you know.
that's right.
So Trimasael is indeed a spirit found in the Grimorium Verum and various predecessor texts. They are located as in a kind of a little group of their own, a second line, said to be under Satanachia, like in the text. And we've talked a little bit about the relationship of the three chiefs and the six, sometimes plus one deputies, and whether or not they are explicitly said to rule or govern or administer to triads of the 18 spirits under them, depending on how we read the text. But it's definitive that Trimasael, along with their guildmates of Heramael, Sugathi, and Sestugriel, are under Satanachia. I call that the Professors Guild because they all seem to be especially about teaching magic. Trimasael seems to have a particular affinity for alchemy, and what gets called chemistry before those are fully distinguished. But as you kind of said in going through Jake's notes, this is another spirit that seems to have a bunch of alter egos. We can trace a paper trail whereby a bunch of texts give other names. Specifically, that yes, by the time we get to the Book of Offices, that Marchiones and Maxane are said to be the same spirit. The big one that kind of opens up a bunch of these is that Trimasael's identified in the German Honorius as Machin, which is also Bathim. So there's a switch from the M to the B, and we get in Vea Bathim and Bathin and Mathim, which seems to be a duplicate, along with Bathim turning up in the Grand Grimoire, Machin in the Livre d'Esprits. And we have this kind of roots of Mach, which began Marcosius, which again is a riff on a Marquis as they turn up in certainly Scott, who's basing his stuff off Vea. So we've got a couple of other appearances. In terms of, as you say, in terms of wolf stuff, Marcosius is said not only to be a great Marquis by Scott, but showeth himself in the shape of a cruel she-wolf, interestingly, in talking about not just heavenly, but also demonic gender. Also said to have griffin's wings, which I think I've riffed on before, has always puzzled me in terms of griffins are said to have eagle wings, so why not just say eagle wings? Again, I'll riff on this later because griffins also turn up in Grey's in relation to the place in London that Arthur Gauntlet was doing his due. At this point, I'm pretty sure it's a heraldic reference that griffins are depicted with a different position of their wings than eagles in heraldry. So I think it's about so again, we aren't always literally talking about the appearance of the spirit and how they moved in the room, but also an image you might make of the spirit that needs to have its wings in a particular configuration. So they're also depicted with a serpent's tail, which is common for most of the aliases of Trimasael that Jake kind of traces and records in Pandemonium. Not the only spirit with a serpent's tail, not even the only spirit with a serpent's tail who spits fire out of their mouth as well, although that's something else they do. Although Scott gets a little coy and says, spitting, I cannot tell what out of his mouth. That might just be him saying, I can't read the text properly. It said that Marcosius, when he is in a man's shape, he is an excellent fighter. He answereth all questions truly. He is faithful in all the conjurer's business. He was of the order of dominations, so establishing his former angelic status. Under him are 30 legions. He hopeth after 1,200 years to return to the seventh throne, but he is deceived in that hope. And this is interesting in terms of like what do demons want, and also this doctrine of restitutionism that Jake also talked about a bunch. That's also present here. Of like if these are framed in a Christian lens of demons are fallen angels, that some of them aspire to return to the city of God themselves. In terms of the book, so we got Marcosius. In terms of the Book of Offices, in terms of looking at like Maxane, if I'm saying that right, who's the eighth spirit under Oriens in the East, that seems to also be an alter ego of Trimasael. They have the power to teach the virtues of all herbs, trees, and stones, which is not unusual, right? That's a pretty common thing that many of these demons have as part of their purview. But I like the specific reference of trees there. And crucially, to bear a man from region to region, which is something else that seems pretty common, especially saying that they can do it in a brief time. And he doesn't appear as a wolf, he appears as a bear, interestingly, but again with a serpent's tail and flame of fire coming out of his mouth. So there's those references, and we can trace like Bathim and Bathin, who are the Grand Grimoire doesn't always give like a huge description of all of those spirits. But Trimasael themselves, we get a reference in Lansdowne 1202 to Ilmasil, then by the Verum forming as the Verum itself. Thanks to Joe Peterson's research, we know that Trimasael, who in the Blochiel, Besteti, and Musi manuscript specifically is Trimasael, teaches chemistry and all sleight of hand, which Italian editions read, and its secrets. So we've got a shift in translation at that point. Giveth the secret of making the true powder of projection. So I think that's worth thinking about in terms of these other offices of being a transporter, of helping people move quickly. That this powder of projection is about projecting yourself somewhere. Has the power to change imperfect metals like lead, iron, or tin. And in some cases, like Besteti and Musi say copper instead of tin, into true gold or silver, the true sun or moon, according to his oaths, etc. However, he must be content with the operator, and vice versa. So again, this like undercurrent of like you've got to find a way to make it work. That's present in the Verum that I like. That they can be willful, but also the idea is you aren't just relying on brute force to get them to do things. And by the time we get to the True Grimoire, Jake's recension of the text, approved by Frimost, we get Trimasael teaches chemistry and all matters of conjuring of the nature of deceit or sleight of hand, which again is probably a reference to arcane and probably specifically alchemical secrets. He also teaches the secret of the powder of projection again, and by means of which the metals may be turned into gold or silver. So here we have the idea of, are we projecting a glamour onto things? Are we making metals appear as other metals? That seems to be a conflation of earlier texts that say he does both things. He makes this powder of projection, which again seems to be more about moving people, as well as having a bunch of like archetypically like alchemical roles and functions. And certainly in comparison to the rest of the guild that he's present with in Verum, Heramael teaching herbs very, very specifically, Sestugriel being a kind of recruitment officer for working with familiars and getting working spirits, and Surgothi governing an awful lot of interpersonal relationship type stuff, charms and glamours and so on. This seems to be the place in the ecology that Trimasael really maximizes, I would say, in terms of working with the spirit. Definitely has stood up for a bunch of I'm not a detailed laboratory alchemist, but certainly in making oils and powders, I've been directed to mark their sigil, which is a very kind of crosshairs looking a thing. It's a circle with like in the middle of a compass, with the kind of crosses of like the equal armed, makes me think that like the Templar one. Definitely marked that on bottles and containers and things like that, and done various preparations with Trimasael's assistance. In terms of the feel of the spirit themselves, they To me, they sound very posh, like snooty even. It's like a deep but very cultured voice. Um, Very sort of would be played by Benedict Cumberbatch kind of thing. Um, and certainly in like Vision, they've often appeared as showing my references here. Harry for pop culture. You know the tar alien that kills Tasha Yar?
Yes,
Yeah, looking a little less like Gribbly than that, but yeah, like
doing God's work.
a being. Yeah, she was a great Aikidoka, and I will have nothing said against her. She wanted out of the contract. It was fair. But
She needed out of the contract. She was bad.
a little less like gribbly and but like a being of smooth tar kind of thing. And when I asked about like why are you coming forth in this visage, I was given a lecture about prima materia and the alchemy of like black and blackness specifically. Definitely a spirit that will go off on one about the
So in other words,
intricacies of.
answer the question.
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, this, talking around a subject, right? Yeah. Yeah, that's most of what I had as an early info dump on them. Again, this idea
Yeah.
of yeah, yeah.
What is the and okay, so this the conflation with Marcosius is interesting, right? For what the happenstance of our creations here.
Mm,
Um and as far as the wolf demoness gives hint for like why for me the notion of February and Lupercalia and the rituals taking place in the cave where the she wolf where Lupa suckles Romulus and Remus and the priests of Jupiter going in there with the Luperci priests and them running through the town with strips of februa of little goat skins to kind of purify everything and it's related to crops and fertility and get us through the harsh months of February.
mm,
I I like this, or I suppose that where merging over into the Kimbanda expression that of the demonic syncretization here. That as far as Pimenta's interesting because the literature does not talk about this much as far as the books that are published, but certainly his pontos and his reputation as a spirit tend to extol that he is a trickster. Like
mm,
he is extremely difficult to deal with, and requires a very specific contract, and clear words about this. There's debate as to whether or not he just dresses and comes as caboclo or is caboclo.
mm,
And part of that, I think, is the conflation of like hot peppers and also the prevalence of tobacco and things like that in Kimbanda lead well to this use of this kind of classic New World tobacco imageries for many issues that weren't, you know, there's a larger discussion to be had there of because of the tropes of the 20th century and the expectations, spirits that would otherwise have accepted coffee now have to accept cachaça type of thing, the joke,
mm,
or that they then accept that meaning there's caboclos quimbanderos, there's pretos veos quimbanderos, there's all of these spirits are in Quimbanda, many of the same spirits that are in quote unquote Umbanda, and yet Quimbanda is usually refined or referred to as part of the spirits of Umbanda. And part of this is really what we're talking about is different ways of working.
yeah.
Originally and very clearly that the more African ways of working were demonized and classified as Kimbanda, and the more spiritist and softer ways of working through, especially a Kardecian informed spiritism, Christian spiritism, changed things into Umbanda. And
Mm,
both are terms that are Congo and have other things going on. So eventually things get mixed and remixed and refined, and everybody's doing different things. But Pimenta as a spirit is also said to influence because of the demonic, right? There's so many things that are lifted from the GV of like alchemy, herbs, and a reputation for powders and things like this.
yeah.
As an Eshu, he tends to heat things up. He's one that likes to stick his finger in the open wound. Those people who are prominent, where he's an Eshu that's around them a lot, you'll see it's very hard to not be like constantly is a little just too much, just in the same way that a pepper bites you once and keeps going, and gets you on the way in and the way out with a lot of grumbling in between. So there's an importance to Pimenta that is, especially as he's employed in workings where he is a really good agent to make people go over the top. So if someone is talking shit, that you can use Pimenta to make them talk even more shit, so that people are like, this person's just talking shit. Like you can't believe their opinion to begin and now at all because it's too much.
Yeah.
Pimenta is the one that overheats the situation in that way, and can liken to, I suppose you could say, like breaking a fever with hot plants, right?
Right.
That you're trying
Rashly
to.
brings the thing to the surface.
Yes, and there's a rubious nature to him, right? In
Mm,
all of that kind of like in willful engagement with this thing of like we know what the pepper is,
mm,
and it's going to have flavor, but it's also going to burn. So there's some interesting sides to Pimenta. I think he has noticeably too short a description in most of the books, especially in the of late, where the spirit catalogs become so important because that's people's exposure to these spirits first and foremost, and they're treating things like I think one of the main influences from the West has become, or Western grimoires specifically, has become the dial a saint mentality or the dial a demon mentality, or like this is the demon that's good for this, as
mhm.
opposed to patronages and tutelage by spirits, and understanding what a familiar spirit becomes within these things where it chooses a name and it says, yeah, I'm most like this thing. Like these are my likes. My personality type is
Yeah.
INFP or whatever it is. Like, so here's
Mhm.
my likes and here's a symbol I'll agree to. And I agree, as
Yeah.
opposed to what it has become of, I'd like to do this working, which Eshu stands up, and that's a completely legitimate way of working. And there's many lines of Kimbanda that work that way. There are also lines that are like, you call you're dead. You call all these things that are here. You have the stability of ancestry and place and all these things in line, and then a spirit comes and announces itself with its sigil, its ponto riscado, and here's how you contact me again and I will take on this job. And you're like, oh, and what's your name? And it's like seven waterfalls under this falling moon. And you're like,
Mhm.
that's a beautiful name.
Mhm.
And that's so I think we've adopted this kind of practice that has become very westernized within a lot of modern Kimbanda. And I think the truth of it is somewhere between the two. Now, in praxis, especially amongst the Kimbanda lines that don't view these necessarily as quote unquote demons,
Mm.
and more as spirits, or any number of names that they might be called under African lens, from everything from Mavambo to Kachisu on the broader terms to, are they ancestral figures? Are they not? So Pimenta, what we can go off of here is, man, did I take caffeine today or something? Because my brain is all over the place. Um, it's the pepper. And the notion that, like, I was just I'm taking a history of Buddhism class right now, and so that's why it's on my mind. But the idea that the Buddha doesn't ever really describe enlightenment, just talks about like get rid of the suffering part, and then the enlightenment part will come after that.
Mm.
Um, and I think about that with half these things is that we're like, oh, but what is he like? You tell me what he's like. He's like, call him. If he
Mm.
comes, you will learn what he's like.
Mm.
And if it's your spirit, you'll really learn what he's like. That there's less of this need for everybody to know everything about every spirit in practicality. In the same way that, like, I look at that influence of the written record of of any of these traditions, that where there's a large spirit catalog and people are like, can you tell me more about this spirit? It was like, I can tell you how I've seen him on this person. I can
Right.
tell you how I've seen him on that person. I can tell you my experience with him in workings. But like, is any of that going to necessarily dictate what this person's version of that spirit is going to be like? No. And that is common throughout all of these spirit traditions, right? Like, we each have our own permutations of and interactions with these spirits, because they're also all nicknames. There's not one Exu Pimenta. There's countless,
Right.
as many people as have that Eshu close to them and are interacting with them. So
Right.
I
A lot of
like,
spirit appearances seem to be reflective more of the encounter between conjurer and conjuree.
yeah, the powder of projection, perhaps, in that way, which also makes me curious of like the authority of the chair, right? The authority of the cathedra, of
Mm.
like appearing before other people, even just by an empty seat.
Mm.
The ghost of the bishop, or the ghost of the vicar of Rome,
Mm.
um, as a true papist might say. Um, Yeah, so I like this conflation. For me, the swimming of the Marquis, the Marquis, Marcosius, and Order of Dominations or Dominions, and bound by Solomon, and that hopes to return to to heaven after 1200 years specifically, and you're like, is 1200 years from when?
Hmm.
When what, like after the fall? Because that seems like that might have happened already.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I'm intrigued. I'm intrigued by this. I like the concept of anytime there's a plant that seems to be the main thing, and Eshu or Pombagira is referencing, and of course Pimenta is there, right? So Eshu, hot pepper,
Mm,
of the nature of a pepper, where some peppers, even within the same plant, can be mildly hot or ridiculously hot. That
mm,
trickster nature is reflected in the plant. That kind of prodding thing that I talked about of like burning in and burning out is reflected in the interaction with the actual fruit. The pepper itself, its nature of heating things up, right? The biochemical reactions to the capsaicin and
mm,
what that might do. He's also a renowned healer, but what is capsaicin used for? Heavily like arthritis and joint pain and things like this. And
mm,
so there's an interesting side of it of like plant issues specifically. One, give us a model on how to perhaps interact with all plants, which is
mm,
an old proposal I have, and I think one of the first articles I ever wrote for the Veritas Genii, um, about plant spirits in Kimbanda, of like approaching every plant as if it is a spirit, to beyond the animism of just like, yes, it has a spirit, but perhaps it has a lot more going
mm,
on, a lot more agency of like, how can we just tune into what its language is? But I'm very curious about spirits like this where the plant is informing the personality, the name of the Eshu, and that these spirits, whether we want to call them Basimbi or Nkisi or um, Mavambo or Kachisu, whatever they are, Eshu in this way is somewhere of a container for a plant to speak, and
mm,
that is its own interesting thing. That if Eshu is messenger across the board, whether it is divinity or spirit, that there is something interesting here, that this is an Eshu that allows the plant to interact in human form.
mm.
Um, or is it like, which is the kind of over metaphysicalization of this concept, or it could conversely be that like we call that guy over there hot pepper because he's always spouting off. Um, and
Right,
like that's just the name of the type of person. And at that point, if these things start to merge in the conflation of the mythic and the poetic and all these things going on, that's hello spirit contact. Um,
right. Whether it's nickname or iconography, like it's still whether it's an official title or one that accrued from the experience of seeing how that spirit do. We're still articulating, like you said, a container of things and a grammar of how to deal with them.
yes. Yeah.
Mm.
So I guess the kind of piggybacking off of that, because that's the first thing that comes to mind. We're talking about as far as a container or something that performs as that allows the plant to perform human.
Mm.
If we're going to go, sorry everyone, the blood runs deep. But then the mighty Storax is so conflated, right, with so many other substances that there's something. I mean, there's styrax, storax, and then various things called liquid amber, and distinct from benzoin, but also called benzoin is also called storax.
Hmm.
Um, so it all brings to mind having freshly written this article on oils. But check it out in the next issue of the Verdant Gnosis series, through the Veritas Genii Symposium. However, that said, what performs as resin, what performs as incense, like this type of thing of incense itself being frankincense and moving out. Oil coming from the word for olive oil, right? And moving
Mm,
out to extend all those things that act like it, that perform like that,
mm,
whether that's through ingestion or flammability and fuel source to anointing. And so liquid amber resin, specifically Storax, um, becomes just one of the many placeholders for fragrant resin. And I love this. ability of what is local to become globalized and therefore lose its specificity, but also like it has to sacrifice its soul a little bit, but also gain something in the interim. In the same way that like, why is it that a Middle Eastern messianic Jewish cult becomes, through the Hellenization and otherwise becomes the main religion of Europe is also a weird thing, right? Of like what
Yeah.
happens when you take something that doesn't have these seasonal rites in the same way that it does now. But that's why those seasonal rites had to be conflated onto local celebrations, because again, as we talked about value centers and stuff like that, things have to adapt.
Mm.
Things don't just disappear. We need our value centers to be upheld as a culture. They don't move that fast. You can't erase them. You can change, you can replace them, you can rename them, but you can't eradicate them. And that's a little bit more heavy of an intro to Storax than perhaps is necessary, but Storax itself and the controversies around it is there. So the
Yeah.
lovely kind of, what is it? I mean, we say balsamic sounds weird because it is balsamic by definition, but it's not the vinegar. But
Right.
the idea
Storax
of
balsam. Yeah.
yeah, of leatheriness to it is a description
Hmm.
sometimes, slightly floral. And I think that's echoing the smell of the skin, specifically of leather, not necessarily like burning leather.
Mm.
That's its own thing. And it's very much an American counterpart that is cited as kind of a alternative and therefore a eco-friendly way of working with Storax, but is it the same? And just because it's not the same doesn't mean it won't do things, as we've learned from every few years, the rehash of biblical plant names.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
this is really this species now. So anyway, I will shut up and cede a little bit to Storax because, but yeah. What performs as Storax for you, Al?
I think part of it was also down to the performance of Storax is an uncertainty about itself. Like that's not a new thing, right? I was reading something that categorically says like there is some degree of uncertainty as to what resin exactly old sources refer to, right? So we've got the small trees and shrubs from Styracea family. We've got, like you said, liquid amber Storax balsam. We've got Turkish sweet gum, liquid amber orientalis, from an unrelated tree in the family of Altingicea, which is also traded as Storax or as Levant Storax. If we look at some like ancient Greek and Roman sources, benzoin is also called Storax and also
Yeah.
conflated with gum Benjamin, Styrax benzoin. You get Pliny in natural history talking about the use of a thing called Storax as a perfume. Scribonius talks about wine flavored with Storax. We've got mentions of it as a fragrant hair dye in the Appendix Virgiliana. Dioscorides, who's again heavily quoted throughout the medieval and early modern period, also reports its use as an incense. And we've had some there's some speculation amongst the archaeo-botanists that this Storax resin of these Greek and Roman sources might well have been Turkish sweet gum rather than a Styrax. And this also starts to look at trade routes again, right? And the fact that the tails of a thing sometimes extend beyond the actual logistic means of buying and selling it, right? That there's a Styrax resin, probably Styrax officinalis, which is imported from the Near East by Phoenician merchants. And we've got Herodotus of Halicarnassus in the 5th century BCE, talking about how even at that point there are different kinds of Storax that are being traded. So like what it's called and what it's used for has itself been kind of debated for a very very long time already. And again, like you said, like there are reclassifications of things. Like we don't officinalis is falling out of favor now, right? Used to just mean used for medicine, right? I believe, or like is edible. I think in some
Yes.
cases. Yeah. Uh,
The most common version to whoever classified it as that term.
right. And then you get reports of a Storax resin of some kind of Southern Arabian species, crucially being used for the harvesting of frankincense. So we've got like incense talking to incense and incense for
Yeah.
incense as well. That it's said to drive away snakes. There's a report that Arabic folks would gather frankincense by burning that storax, which Phoenicians carried to Hellas. So it's even being identified by like it again by its trade routes, right? They burn this and so get the frankincense. For the spice-bearing trees are guarded by small winged snakes of varied color, many around each tree. These are the snakes that attack Egypt, it was said. Nothing except the smoke of storax will drive them away from the trees. So this idea of a vermifuge of sorts being employed in order to get the incense that's frankincense, that is the frankly incense. So yeah, there's some really interesting examples of it turning up by the early modern period, where again, it's either talked about by its aliases or in very close proximity to its aliases.
Mhm.
So Agrippa talks about making Jupiterian incense from the seed of ash, lignum aloes, storax, comma, the gum benjamin, along with lazuli stone, the tops of the feathers of peacocks, and that this is incorporated with the blood of a stork or a swallow or the brain of a hart. He also mentions solar incense, which again, the sun, by the kind of rule of thumb, takes any and all resins potentially. So Agrippa again says all gums, frankincense, mastic, benjamin, storax, laudanum, ambergris, and musk. Reginald Scott also gives a fumigation for satin made of frankincense trees, pepperwort roots, storax, and galbanum, and also
Mhm.
specifies the spirits Marbus, Corban, and Stilcon as being like particularly saturnine spirits that will either respond to this or will even help you prepare it, maybe. Um, Talks about it as as all of these of the first order in astringency are appeased and provoked. So again, this idea of like, why is it saturnine and solary? Well, it might do more than one thing, right? And in this case, it's
Yeah.
about the astringency. It says when the fumes are put upon a tripod in the hour of Saturn, according to planetary division. These fumigations make these spirits appear like old men with beards and meager looks, like serpents, cats, wolves, badgers, panthers, and old men in armor, like trumpeters in many ranks and divisions. And he likewise seems to replicate Agrippa's recipe for a Jupiterian thing. Where he says, yeah, take lignum aloes, ashen keys, benjamin, storax, peacock's feathers, and lapis lazuli. And again, with the blood of a stork, swallow, or hart, brains also being added. The fumes are kindled in Jupiter's hour and in a place appropriate to his nature. So we have the idea of like locative value is also important in where and how you burn incense. And by this
Yeah.
sacrifice, the spirits of the next order are called up like glorious kings with many attendants and mighty pomp, with heralds before them and ensign bearers, trumpeters, guards, and all sorts of musical instruments.
Mm.
So it's like it's mentioned as an important resin, and like later on, I don't know exactly when this happens, but you also get Storax being heavily associated with Mercury in like at least post 19th century, maybe even 20th century, um, as a resin for mercurial work in general when it's like simplified to like single ingredients.
Yeah, certainly I had been told many years ago that that was sideways influence from more Levantine and Middle Eastern sources.
Yeah,
Um,
that would make sense.
and that would make sense just with it coming into the record at that time with the increase of translation of things in that way.
Yeah,
Um, and certainly especially the way that it gets tends to get used in recipes now in my observation because it is what storax is specifically and because of the plethora of things that are called storax when we refer to black storax specifically which is I think Miniaki in ancient Egypt in this way that it is Mercury Saturn lunar in its description of things but it was listed as solar very commonly until recent times there's tends to be this association with anything psychopompish and mercurial about that. And I wonder if the Saturnine solar influence that is like the common bridge being the sun in the underworld, or Mercury as guide of the dead, in that
Mm.
way might be there because black Storax is especially used in Hecate recipes.
Mm.
And Storax is favored in that way. But I also know that like because Storax is also the lesser qualities are like, oh, that's not real Storax, but like I can't hear you over 3,000 years of this being also called Storax. Um, and which one is in the recipe. But the notion of Storax being a bulk resin that is put in to help amplify the smells of higher priced resins or
Mm.
more expensive resins, which are certainly benzoin certainly fits that bill within like Latin American recipes.
Yeah.
Whoever was importing that and calling that, but you weren't allowed to use copal that was native to all over the place in various trees, which has a very piney, citrusy scent. So it's interesting of like this the rules of import and scarcity and specialness and how these things go about. I'm curious of Storax's kind of shift towards the mercurial and the therefore by extension the kind of again when we're working with these things magically of like okay Saturn and solar well first off brings up alchemy issues in a wonderful way too, right, like provided with eyes thou departest type of Mudus Liber stuff.
Mm.
But going into uh, the what is the denominator out of that of like the again the underworld thing the psychopomp there and then applying that cross pantheon to seeing Storax in both its European or old world forms and new world forms of like liquid amber Americana, not Americana, but it was a Styraciflua,
Mm.
which is there. So both of those are then I see very commonly mixed into trickster recipes from the New World. So like out in
Mm.
California, I would see like here's a recipe for the coyote creator spirit, and it has Storax in it. Here's a recipe for Tezcatlipoca, and it has Storax in it, in addition to other ingredients. But it's interesting how it became the dark mercury, the dark trickster crossroads nature of mercury that's there.
Mm.
And we again, if you look up Umbanda and Kimbanda recipes, there's a ton of benzoin that is sometimes called Storax as well that's in those recipes, but that just seems to be the name of a bunch of cheap resins that were coming in, and that's what you could get.
Right.
The quality is not high that is being used and being sold to this day in Botanicas. But
Right, which raises that issue of like, yes, the folk magic of making what little you have work as far and as powerfully as it can. But again, also the idea of like these aren't necessarily recipes that are designed to baffle and confuse people by the range of exotic ingredients you have. They're working off what's available.
yeah, and
They're
certainly conspicuous consumption is its own sacrifice, right? Of like
yes.
I have the ability to find this. I can have someone go track a heart for me or an eagle for me and spare its blood into my incense. And these subfumigations themselves, it's also important to realize that the resins are in bulk because they extend the life of the burn. So
Mm,
if you're going to have hairs from a unicorn's butthole in your incense, you might want to like cut those up into tiny little pieces and mix it into a bunch of a dough that you see like the Greek Orthodox people make because you kind of got to stretch it because hair burns real quick, feathers burn real quick, brain matter does dries very into I've heard into much less volume than you'd think.
yeah.
So the resins themselves are a way of extending the life through both providing a little bubbling fondue for the other ingredients to stick to, and the dry herbs themselves that might be put in. All
Yeah.
of that is extended by the resin.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think all resins are by their nature somewhat mercurial in that way of extending and allowing other things to transmit through their the properties by which we are holding them of burning for a prolonged period of time.
Yeah. A
And their
conducting.
slowness of the burn being saturnine by its nature.
Right. Yeah, 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 yeah. Something that's both like conductive and also like a mixing agent. Hmm. Hmm.
Mm. It's funny because the nature of the mineral, the chosen mineral of the day, cinnabar,
Hmm.
um, which is itself, a primarily mercury and sulfur, predominant identifiable parts. It's got a lot of things there, but mercury sulfide um, has a mixed reputation, right? It's a popular pigment, and has been used throughout the centuries, and is kind of anything that is that color is referred to as cinnabar in the
Yeah.
in the world trades of vermilion. Um, mercurochrome type of coloring thing that goes on there, but it represents that kind of blood life force that is redness. But
Hmm.
because it's also mercury, it is various levels of bad studies about toxicity. Um,
Talking about
and
mercurial study, right? Like the
yeah,
dark mercury of no, I assure you it's this, and this is exactly how toxic it is and isn't.
yeah, and that cinnabar itself varies in its mercury toxicity, but there's no, there I've seen everything from studies that say it's absolutely unsafe to handle bare hand,
Mm,
to people being like it's not absorbable by the flesh. Like you
mm,
shouldn't be putting it on open wounds,
yeah.
but like so it's interesting to see things go all the way around of its various toxicities. Um,
Yeah, it's a great topic to I'm yeah, again surprised we haven't done it yet because it raises so many things, right? It is literally mercury sulfide, right? So it's not just alchemical mercury and sulfur, although it pertains to those mysteries, right? The name itself is from the Greek kinnabari, right?
yeah,
Which apparently is most likely applied by Theophrastus to, again, a bunch of different things. How about that? In Latin, it gets called minium, which is also a term for red cinnamon. So it's also identified by its, like you said, its coloration. And cinnamon is again like a Proto-Indo-European word, as far as we can tell, or its root, right? It's named after something else that's very very old that we've encountered before, right? There's that lovely sense of like the existential or existentialist philology of like how do you name something new? Well, you use what you already have, right? That giraffe looks like a big long necked horse, right?
yeah,
Like we have to, we can't just make up whole new terms without saying what they're like or without combining the old into something new, right? The root of not just creativity but like being able to name and use something. And the fact is, yeah, cinnabar is incredibly old, mined for thousands of years. Yeah, Neolithic. By the Roman era, it's mined as both a pigment and again for its mercury content. It's
yeah,
the most common sourcing ore for refining like actual elemental mercury. Hence the the varying reports about its toxicity.
yeah,
It's a very early example of also like lab alchemy type stuff. What's his name? Ascent of Man guy, Bronowski, talks about it. Shows the experiment of it in his wonderful history of civilization. I think Charlie Brooker refers to as a wonderful warm bath in university water. Um, you produce liquid mercury with crushed cinnabar or roasted in rotary furnaces, and it separates from the sulfur and unfortunately easily evaporates as well. And so you use a condensing thing like a column for collecting the liquid metal, which was often then shipped in iron flasks. Um, and that refined mercury is itself used to gild silver and gold objects. So we also don't just have what you call it gold making as an ideal or as a metaphorical alchemy. It's also literally involved in the process of making things at least look golden, if not gilding them. And yeah, as you said, it's the historical source for the various pigments from kind of brilliant red or scarlets or brick that we call vermilion, which again people seem to agree comes from some. It seems to be the same root as worms, but we're not quite sure, or I couldn't quite find out where exactly that fits. But I do find it interesting that vermilion isn't one specific hue, right? That
hmm
mercuric sulfides make a whole range of different hues, if not colors, from like very bright orange red to duller sort of reddish purple. often said to compared to like a fresh liver. Um,
Mm,
and apparently the differences are caused, I learned, by the size of the ground particles of the pigment. So larger crystals produce like duller and less orange hues.
mm,
And again, vermilion, gosh, we've got archaeological records dating its production with ground cinnabar from 8,000 to 7,000 BCE.
yeah.
It's found in like Neolithic villages in Turkey. Um, and then you also get techniques for making synthetic vermilion using, again, sulfur and mercury. And this starts to happen, I think, in Europe in the ninth century. But the pigment's still super expensive. And so apparently it's almost as expensive as the gold leaf itself. So that's an interesting part of like it's a tool for gilding with real gold, but it's also at least as costly in some cases. I was also watching a thing on medieval illuminated manuscripts where they would deliberately use something that didn't sink into the page that would like raise up, and then they'd gild over that, so it looked like you were using more gold than you were as well. And the alternative for those kind of illuminated manuscripts is the other thing called minium. Again, it's a red thing, but it's less expensive and it's made with red lead. And that was used for rubrics for red letters and symbols in text. And often in illuminated manuscripts, you do the first letter prior to that much punctuation. If you needed to break up to show that this sentence has ended and another has begun, you would do a red letter to begin the next sentence. So
Mm.
there's some like fun punctuation stuff going on. I
That's interesting.
Yeah, I came across a an account by this Florentine artist in the Renaissance, talking about how what the kinds of vermilion you should and shouldn't use, bearing in mind that like again, it could mean a number of different colors. Oh, it's also sensitive to time, right, as well. So it could produce a very vivid and bright red, and we have accounts of like, oh, he painted it and it was like this beautiful scarlet, but it turns dark over time. It doesn't necessarily have the greatest shelf life, especially in works of art, spanning hundreds of years and stuff. And it's Cennino Cennini, who describes in this handbook for artists. He talks about it. Where's this quote here? This pigment is made by alchemy, prepared in a retort, which subject I will leave be, since to put every method and recipe into my discussion would be too long-winded. The reason? Because if you care to take the trouble, you will find a lot of recipes for it, and particularly if you cultivate friendships with monks. But so that do not waste your time with the many different techniques, I advise you, just take what you can find at the apothecaries for your money. And I want to teach you how to buy it and how to recognize the good vermilion. Always buy solid vermilion and not crushed or ground. The reason? Because more often than not, you are cheated either with red lead or crushed brick. So,
Mm,
like,
mm.
again, what is performing it and what is performing it at the point of sale versus in its use in art and illuminated manuscripts, and how long do those last?
I mean, it's fascinating the parallels right there of performance of like what is a genuine performance versus
Mm,
not,
mm-hmm,
even though they're all performing red. And that's a whole other like one of the things that I have thought about repeatedly in, within specifically within the Orisha community of like the achet of color and color as not only a classifier of power and style and how things are grouped,
mm,
um, but also the concept of color itself becoming more it's complicated by the fact that within Yoruba, this concept of threefold division of red, white, and black is not actually those colors, but vibrancy, darkness, and
mm,
paleness,
yeah.
and that there's vibrant colors that are called red, active colors. So it's one of those things of that which is super red will always be sought after because it is performing like vermilion is sought out because of performing redness. In addition to being how we extract mercury, there's a lot of things there that bring up. And we talked about a little bit this about silver too, because of family ancestry for me and the Guanajuato silver mines of mercury being used to extract silver, right,
Mm,
from amalgamation and silver ore. And so the life expectancy for people and the funneling of indigenous people into the mines, still to this day is a very common thing for those areas where mines exist. But with cinnabar specifically, you can't. I can't not think of Almaden in Spain. So Almaden is, we're talking anywhere from 2 to possibly 5,000 years of continuous operation, up until the recent era. And it is the primary source in the Mediterranean basin uh, for cinnabar.
Mm.
So Almaden is, which in Arabic is literally Almadin, the metal. And I have my Mexican accent coming into then. Almaden, I guess you could say. Almaden is just it's a Roman and then Moorish settlement. Then it was Visigoth, and then it was 1151 was Christian. And there's just the mercury deposits. They account for the largest quantity of mercury produced in the world. It is the toxicity of it associates the entire process of mining to slave labor, penal labor, prisoners of war, and everything. So it stopped only in 2002. And that
Blimey.
was because Europe posed a mercury mining prohibition. It only allows existing mercury or mercury from other places, but not
Uh,
within European borders. So there's a lot going on there. Almaden and Idrija, I think, in Slovenia, are like that's the Mercury places. In 2012, were declared World Heritage Sites. Almaden's in the south. It's about parallel with what I call the foramen magnum and the nose of the peninsula.
mm,
So like Portugal has this little piece that's obviously a nose and an upper lip. If you draw a line from there to a part that sticks out on the back end, kind of looking over towards Mallorca, Menorca, Ibiza area. There's like a little place which would be the base of the skull where the spine would go in. It's sitting there in the lower third of Spain, almost to the center of the country.
mm.
But it is Castilla-La Mancha. It is just there's tremendous wealth there. Most of the mercury sent there was sent to Sevilla, and I think of all of the pageantry of Sevilla, including the purples and the Tyrian purples and the crimsons and all of these things. So
Yeah.
this performance of color is not far from me there in what this, with everything there. Um, 20, I think a one out of every four convicts in Almaden, it was noted even by the 1500s, died before their release dates, and they weren't there for long.
Wow.
It's just mercury poisoning was terrible. So cinnabar, especially this cinnabar, has so much reputation of its, the poems that will come out of this of like the redness is due to the blood of those that have died
Mm,
cultivating it. And like the harder they work, the prettier your red will be.
mm.
So there's just amazing things there. The exhaustion associated with it. But yeah, it's the if it weren't for the many people feel if it wasn't for the mass that was you had to forcibly attend and the feast days, that the miners would never have gotten a break and would have died much faster. Um, so it's a lot.
Yeah.
So Almaden is like the holding over your head of like, do you want to go harvest cinnabar? Um,
Down, down the red
so
mines.
yeah. Um, so all of that's there. It's like talk about mercurial and psychopompic and like drawing things down into the rest. The one thing I thought about vermilion was that it was called that because of an insect dye that was used, and vermilion looks similar to it.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Um, so it would be similar to um,
Cochineal.
yeah, cochineal in the new world of like if somebody was like, oh, it's little snail crush of like snail red.
Yeah.
So I think it's interesting that all these uh the red and the animal sacrifice of our kind of need for colors is quite interesting.
Mm,
Um and the lack of any understanding in a modern context of how much of our culture is dependent upon a complete dominance of the environment, that we then try and do with synthetics, which oftentimes are done through the aegis of, yes, now inanimate, quote unquote, non-animal sources, but were animal at one time, whether it's coming from plastics and oil or things like this. But
right.
the energy productions there, and I saw someone uh, recently talking. It was when I was googling. Cinnabar actually, of like some long essay blog post that was in Spanish about comparing AI and its waste of resources to like mining for Cinnabar.
Mm.
Um, that is this really what we've become, that in feeding the global need for redness, that we have um, completely ignored the fact that we destroy the world with our need to have generated art. Um, but that
Huh.
aside, it's always easier to talk about other people's opinions than my own. Um,
Teaching
I
the
mean, I do.
controversy.
Yeah, yeah, spread that bitch. Yeah, the cinnabar itself and its coloring, as well as its source of mercury. There's something enjoyable for me in the complexity of cinnabar, because the sulfur side, like as you said, the merging of two what otherwise alchemical elements and their earthly physical counterparts is quite fascinating.
Mm.
This is a reddening, a red work. Um, a Rubius of sorts. And so there seems
Hmm.
to be another theme out of this, that I always look for the why is it that they always say that Valentine's Day has its origins in Lupercalia, and the only thing I could find really was the lottery that they
Hmm.
did of like pulling a woman's name out of a bin, and the coupling being done for a temperate for the entire length of the festival, and if it works then you consider dating them in real life.
Hmm.
Of Past that, it is real life, even in the right ritual, but that you consider a longer match if it works. And it's like, okay, I get that, the whole will you be my Valentine, for today we act as if we're a couple,
Hmm.
and then we'll see if we want to do this more. So
Yeah.
maybe there's something there, because otherwise I'm like, I wish people were dressing up, running through the streets naked, dressed like wolves, and hitting me with goat strips. But that doesn't
We
seem
used to
to
be a
be.
proper civilization.
That's right, certainly. And you know, I used to know where the old city walls were, and now I don't even know anymore. Um,
This redness of the Wolf Festival perhaps brings us to the
yeah,
particularly martial animal of the wolf itself,
yeah,
which is
yeah.
a great beast, right? In terms of like it itself is a byword for some of the more negative ways that we talk about things being bestial, not just as like
Hmm.
not smart. And the intelligence of the wolf is like questioned at various times. Sometimes it's very smart, sometimes it's a slave to its hunger. But certainly, like so, Agrippa frames it as a martial beast. It says all such animals as are warlike, ravenous, bold, and of clear fancy, along with goats and horses as well. It's a decidedly choleric animal in terms of its humors. And I went through old Eddie Topsell and his history of four-footed beasts for some grand old stuff. But probably worth pointing out that we get fairly, early biblical reference of Christ in the Gospels talking about false prophets and about how they come to you in sheep's clothes but are inwardly ravening wolves. And specifically, that ravening is harpages, which Topsell gives a typology of different kinds of wolves and talks about the second kind, which is probably what we think of as a classic wolf, where he says it has a greater and larger body than the first kind, being swifter than all others. Betime in the morning, he being very hungry, goeth abroad to hunt his prey. The sides and tail are of a silver colour. He inhabiteth in mountains, except in the winter time, wherein he descendeth to the gates of cities or towns, boldly, without fear, killeth both goats and sheep, yet by stealth and secretly. So this kind of combination of like it is a slave to its hunger. It's also bold, which itself is boldness is itself a pre-modern passion. It's not just a personality trait. It like courage is regarded as a thing you feel, not just a thing you do. But also along with this like ravenousness, it also has some subtlety, some subterfuge, some capacity for stealth and secrecy, and that it will invade towns, but it is still a wild thing. There's been discussion for a very long time in the ancient world about like, are wolves? It's not evolution. It's literally like, are wolves just dogs? Are dogs just wolves that came to live in cities? And a lot of people discount it because they're like, no, because when a dog goes feral, it's just a wild dog. It doesn't become a wolf. It's this very early take on not evolution, but still trying to work out how animals are related to each other.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Which is fascinating. By the time we get to Shakespeare, because I've been dipping a lot more into the bardic cunning, you have like King Lear's fool saying like he's mad that trusts in the tameness of the wolf, the idea of it being undomesticatable. Um, and it's interesting how often Shakespeare talks about wolves, given that there aren't actually any wolves living in England by Shakespeare's time. They'd all been hunted into extinction by like the 15th century. There are some in Scotland for a lot longer, but it's like one of old Billy's like go-to metaphors for like violence, greed, savagery, and a bunch of other kind of like merciless conducts. And then you get its connection to being a beast of the night. You get its hunger and its greed, its brute cunning, as well as some like particular magics and things. Can go into those. But is there anything that I'm rambling already that's sparking anything for you?
Yeah, oof, Wolf. Okay. So there's a lot there, and that I mean, like it's funny because I have so many other things prepared. But the thing that like was striking me as I was looking through things last night is like my earliest memory of like a strong wolf thing is the nothing in Neverending Story, and
Hmm. Hmm.
the I mean, Neverending Story is based on a German fantasy novel, so it would be, of course, there's going to be remnants of like Germanic Norse myth of like the wolf that eats the sun and things like this. But the idea that like what's the quotes of like a hole would be something? No, it was nothing, and it got bigger and bigger.
Ugh.
And it's the emptiness that's left. It's like despair destroying this world, and I've been trying to help it. Um, and like this notion of the nothing as embodied by the wolf, its ravenousness, its seductiveness of like come to me, the Little Red Riding Hood aspects of it, but
Hmm.
also that it represents adulthood and the
Hmm.
disillusion, and the what happens when fantasy is allowed to become nothing.
Hmm.
And you know, there was this reminds me there was I think it was Sam Neill, the Merlin that he did. I think we talked about this on the Merlin episode,
Hmm.
but uh is it Miranda Richardson maybe was playing Morgan Le Fay in it, who we should
Hmm.
do as a dead magician another time.
Hmm.
But in order for the weird twistedness of Morgan Le Fay trying to interfere with mortal life so much that the way around this was to embrace the Christians and to forget that Morgana was a thing, so
Hmm.
that the weaponry of the nothingness it plays into that for me of just what this wolf is. And there's all the metaphors in our language, right? Of the wolf at the door. There's a fantastic movie, Company of Wolves, which is just, I'm sure if you know it, you know it. But exploring wolf myths and things like this, and transformations, uh, the conflation with werewolves, of man wolves, of werewolves and vampires being the same thing until, you know, the last few hundred years.
Hmm.
That there's the notion of the wolf tree, the wolf being created by from the pear tree, in Balkan myth that that Katarina can talk about. Um, but I also love that in Spanish, pear is pera, Pera, and bitch is perra, as in a female dog. And there's this notion of la bestia, the beast, that is present throughout Europe, and it plays into Morris dancing. It plays into conceptions of like the bear sun and those tales, as researched by dear friend Roz Frank and others, of just the beast being this primal darkness, this primal thing that is in contrast to the bear, to the Arthurs,
Hmm.
to the heroes, the Hercules, and things like this that have more bear-like qualities. And the notion and conflation with the the constellation of lupus and other things that are there. There's a lot of mythology that's there, and that's its own, like, go down that rabbit hole. Go read Ross Frank's shit. Go read a bunch of other people's stuff that are looking at like performativity and the performance and repertoire of folk dancing that doesn't line up with Christianity and doesn't, but barely lines up with Indo-Europeanness. That these are, we're dealing with myths that are older than the groups that then adopted them, and value centers that won't shift. So this notion of the wolf, this is the winter time, right? The bear is asleep, and the wolf is the thing that we leave the land to. So the wolf is the lord of the forest during this time. We know at other times that the lord of the forest is the bear, but the bear is not awake now. So the prevalence of Candlemas and the Candlemas bear, which becomes the groundhog in America, but or the badger by as the little cousin of the bear, right? Because they're like little bears. They're cranky little things that hibernate. So all of that's tied into wolfness for me. I think, yes, Duran Duran, and Hungry Like the Wolf. So I guess there's a lot there. I remember being fascinated by like how is Juno so different than Hera? And yes, there's like the difference of like the Etruscan influence of these deities, right? Unotinia and Minerva and things as the triumvirate that becomes like the Jupiter and Juno and Minerva, as like this triumvirate of power, but that Juno wears the war sash of the wolf, and that there's a like the need to celebrate having been born from the wolf of the Romans is so interesting. There was this oh God, I'm gonna remember it, and it will definitely be a red thread. I will try and delay enough in my talking right now that I can find the damn music video of this artist who refers to being a bitch wonderfully. This is Solan, I believe, and the song is Rome. But translated, okay. This jungle owes me mea culpas by the shovelful, walking between rats, vultures, and hyenas. I can't even count the times I've been called a bitch. No, I can't even count the times I've been called a bitch, but it's a bitch who raised Rome. Whores like me carry men's dreams. It's a bitch who raised Rome. Whores like me carry men's dreams. And it's a wonderful reversal, right? Of like, you're going to call me this thing? This is
Yeah.
the Roman Empire. The thing that supposedly men think about every day is on the back of a she-bitch, of a she-wolf.
Yeah.
And that notion of what it is to be feral, what it is to be, I think of Reardon's books, as far as like the Olympians, the young Olympians, and the counterpart of from Camp Half-Blood to the Roman counterpart over, and it's on the West Coast in those series. It's been a decade and a half. But the notion that like the Roman children are just like raise yourself. If you survive, we'll figure it out. And that kind of lupus nature, right, of children of the wolf, like you have to figure out how to fend for yourself a little bit. That kind of Spartan nature that is so revered of, the argument for like the why king's blood goes sour, right? That conquerors and the people that have this ability to set order then have children that didn't grow up having to set that order and therefore don't understand what it is. One, that's an over romanticization, right? And we could talk about slaughter, conquest, and otherwise, but and the lovely things of colonialism and empire. But there is something to that, right? Of like every generation is not necessarily going to be understanding the values of the previous generations if we didn't go through the same struggles.
Yeah.
And this notion that's been used to justify how war is necessary to reify generations and identity and to fight for values and things like that. It's like, I get it, like it's important, but also like rampant death, and the nothing, and the
Yeah.
loss of innocence and reenchantment and anything that goes from that. So the wolf, all those things.
Yeah, I think there's a key difference there between saying maybe inheritance isn't the best way to decide who gets to tell other people to go die for them,
Yes.
versus the crypto fascism of like weak men make difficult times and blah blah blah. Yeah,
Yeah, if it doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger type of mentality. Sure, sure, whatever.
or just
But
hobbles you for life.
but I mean, as any in your group of nerd friends, which we have, that's our group of friends. We would attest that we have at least one shining example, if not many, that two smart people do not make a smart child, and two dumb people do not make a dumb child.
Right.
There it is. These things are genetics is an advocacy for the opposite of eugenics, right? Like diversity actually strengthens. And
Yeah.
um, having my little four-headed goat incest babies, of of the child of the mama, just so here's the problem is you don't want to corral them right, and he gets to mature too quickly, and it's one of those things of like, I don't know, as one goat herd friend said to me, he's like, at one time it was all Adam and Eve. I was like, yeah, but the vet is like, even one time of incest is bad for pet goats, because when you're going to eat a goat at a year, you don't care that it has a liver that's going to fail at age 5.
Right. Or a
When
second
is your
head. Yeah.
Yeah, or a little baby goat inside actually calling all the shots that speaks I don't know, Russian. Um, but yeah, so the wolf as metaphor, the wolf as hunger. We had. I would love to hear sometime the notion, because it's fascinating, having researched how many groups claim descent from the bear
Mm.
um, in Europe, but there are a few groups that claim descent from the wolf, and that's Romans and Serbians. And
Mm.
everybody else is like, we're bear people, because the bear is the ancestral figure of Europe, right? There's no monkeys to compare that this is like the hominid, but if you shave a bear, it looks like a giant fat person.
Right.
And we have learned a lot of our safety tests and herbalism and otherwise, um, from the Ursine. So bear as the antithesis of this, bear as metaphor for the devil, bear, which is strange because like usually you go goat, but
Mm.
but wolf is there. The wolf at the door. The notion that wolves come up from the underworld, from wells, is a common
Mm.
folk thing that you see. The wolf coming up from the well in the center of town and snatching children away, in the same way that we saw with like we've talked about with Raven,
Mm.
of like snatching children away. These different notions of the wolf is cunning, the wolf is uh sexual awakening, is adulthood, is the loss of innocence in many ways.
Mm.
And so I guess there's something very interesting about all of that, and again highlights Rome as being the because I can speak more about Rome than I can the Serbians. Kat, we'll have to ask you about that another time.
Mm.
But just the notion that we have this ferociousness in us, um, as the descendants of Rome, as is cited of like children of the blood of the bull and the wolf, it's talked about in Spain, right? Of like the inheritors of Rome, but also like the bullfight and how we go through these things and sacrifice and um, yeah. So wolf, wolf,
Wolf.
wolf.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Ooh.
How woo indeed. Um, Looking at some of the stuff on like early animal fables, and how they do actually serve a variety of purposes. I was reading Lisa Blake and Catherine Vomero Santos talking about how what they call fabulous, are especially known for lying, which is both you've got to be smart enough to lie, but also getting caught in your lies is not smart, right? They
Yeah.
say that often that the wolf is depicted as a less subtle fox, with all the malice and violence, but none of the cleverness, which I rather
Mm,
liked. And there are some examples of like, again, the kind of pre-modern like natural history trying to point out like, yes, they're an infiltrator. Yes, yeah, the wonderful stuff on like loss of innocence, the blood on the lamb and stuff. But there's some interesting examples of like how, say, like Topsel says that they will hunt specifically. He says, oh, where is it? They will deceive goats. They come unto them with the green leaves and the small boughs of osseous in their mouths, wherewithal they know goats are delighted, and so they may draw them therewith as to bait to devour them. So this idea again of like watching how animals use herbs in a
yeah.
variety of ways, like that's often the historiola, right? Not just, oh, this god punched this god and he spat teeth out, and that's where this plant grew. But also, like, we've seen animals do this thing with this plant that seems to do the same for us as well. So this idea that like they lure their prey with they use some herbs and stuff. I found really
Mm.
fascinating. Again, to serve their ravenous hunger, right? And that when they're hungry, they rage. So this link between hunger not as weakening but as inflaming, right? When they are
Yeah.
hungry, they rage much. And again, this rage is categorically not the. They're often compared or contrasted to lions as well because they're also choleric, but they have none of the nobility. When who's it? Carl Steele talks about like reductionist animal metaphor when he says the wolf nothing but a despoiler of other people's property, nothing but its appetite. And again, how like ultimate hangry mode, right? That they'll make it everyone else's problem when they lack. Again, they are regarded as an enemy of civilization, and yet even the wolf mother can lactate and nurture the twins and things like that,
Hmm.
which is an interesting turnaround of things.
Mm.
There's some associations with the moon, of course, right?
Yeah.
They're baying at it. Um, Topsel claims that the Grecians do call them Nycterinoi canes, dogs of the night. And he also says that apparently the brains of a wolf do decrease and increase with the moon. So, not unlike how people talk about cats' eyes changing in accordance with the waxing and waning moon. And it says their eyes are yellow, black, and very bright, sending forth beams like fire, and carrying in them apparent tokens of wrath and malice. And for this cause, it is said they see better in the night than in the day. So they're, again, beasts
Mm.
of the night. And this also gets into where they are and aren't of Apollo, right? And the Lycos stuff of that, which is, which is, again, an interesting comparison. They are judged by what they're not a lot of the time.
That's interesting.
By the time we get
There's a
to, oh, sorry, go on.
you're just reminding me there is like there's debate because we can talk about the wild hunt as its own thing on perhaps another episode, but
Mm,
because people feel really heavily that the wild hunt is mainly if not a complete creation, but heavily inflated in its prominence and importance by the Brothers Grimm.
mm,
Um, but notions of werewolves and dogs and wolves themselves during the times of the Wild Hunt, so the Ember Days and things like this, that the wolf would howl, would come to the door, right, and steal your beer, especially,
huh,
and food, and your raid your larders, and this part is really important, right, because beer is preserved water. So if water is not flowing because it
mm,
is frozen, beer is your way within the house to make sure that you have liquid.
yeah,
And beer is more commonly drunk than water throughout much of the Middle Ages and even beyond, and
right.
arguably by many people today. So I'm curious about that notion of it there. I also think about the wild hunt lore that exists amongst the Pyrenees and in Spain of Herodias and others, that the donning the wolf pelt is a thing, right? That you see the leaders, like, because of the hounds of Gabriel, right? They go into that in
Yeah.
other wider lore as well. That the relationship between the hunting hounds as being tamed version of wolves, but turning to wolf in certain circumstances, that there's something there. The connection is interesting, and the relationship to lunar goddesses and dogs, of course, in general, of like, the bitch whose house shakes the universe of Hecate, and like
Yeah.
what those things are, of like the wolf doesn't get cited so much, but in statues a lot people depict wolves rather than hounds or
Mm,
domesticated dogs, even though what she ate in Greece was domesticated dog.
yeah.
So sorry to interrupt. I just little spurts of
No, no, not an interruption at all. No, that's really interesting, right? Like we want the hunting dog to demonstrate fierceness, but we also don't want it to bite the hand that sets it out.
yeah,
Has to have
yeah,
it talk about it as a catharsis or as a being halfway between things. Yeah, yeah, that's interesting. In terms of the like animalia, like components, there's a
yeah.
lot of stuff about because wolves are fearsome, they will make other animals afraid in sometimes useful ways. So there's a bunch of stuff about like wolf foot track that we find throughout pre-modern
Hmm.
Europe. You can stop a horse in its tracks by laying a wolf foot track in its way.
Or
You
throwing
can.
a stick on the ground. Yeah, for a snake. Anyway.
You can, if it's Topsail says that if the tail of a wolf be hung in the crotch, I don't know if that's crotch of oxen, they can never eat their meat. They're like too tense. Which I don't know if you do that to starve them of your enemy's oxen or if you're trying to put them on diets. They yeah, likewise, the tail or skin or head of a wolf be hanged upon the sheepcote. The sheep are much troubled and cannot eat their meat for fear. So literally that. Even said that the skin of a wolf corrodes the skin of a lamb. So they're like so antipathetic that it'll actually like damage the thing. The strings of an instrument made from the guts of a wolf being strained upon a harp or lute with strings made from sheep's guts will make no harmony. That's a fun one.
Mm.
And then there's stuff about what's this? Oh yeah, right. So a comparison and then contrast to lions. Right, wolves do likewise fear fire, even as lions do, and therefore they which travel in woods and secret places by night, wherein there is any suspicion of meeting wolves, they carry with them a couple of flints, wherewithal they strike fire. And in the approach of the ravening beast, which so dazzleth their eyes and daunteth their courage, that he runneth away fearfully. So we can resort to a fiery thing to exert a fiery dominance over a fiery ravenous thing,
Hmm.
which is also interesting. We can strike fear by being the wielders of fire. There's stuff again about their boldness and courage. Agrippa talks about when he's talking about the virtues of things are in some according to the species as boldness and courage in a lion and cock, fearfulness in a hare, which we talked about, or lamb, and ravenousness in a wolf. So you can imbue a sense of like, which can also be like ambition and things like that. There's also
Hmm.
yeah. There's also some stuff around again boldness as a passion and not just as a personality trait can be stirred in the heart and stir to action. There's more stuff about their eyes as well, about when Agrippa is talking about, yes, the evil eye, but also like overlooking, looking over things. When he's talking about basilisks and other types of gazing business, he says the like virtue is there in the eyes of some wolves, which if they see a man first, make him amazed and so hoarse that he would cry out. So they have this kind of like they can paralyze with fear, I guess, as a way of putting it. He also interestingly talks about how, in his section on what animalia needs to be taken from a still living animal, he says if you take the tooth of a wolf, you must not kill the wolf, which lends a different quality to yes, sourcing your ingredients, but also like this is I didn't shoot it first and then gather the tooth. Like that wolf is still around somewhere and presumably like not happy with me. Like
Yeah,
someone wrestled this wolf for this ingredient,
yeah.
which is
You're
a
gonna do
very different take.
the crocodile and Captain Hook type of thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you got an enemy for life now. Yeah, better use that for something good. There's another one that I've encountered a little bit before when Scott's talking about different things that are used for a variety of unbewitchings, more preventatives than cures. Scott says in some countries they nail a wolf's head on the door to keep away witches, and I've pondered on what extent that is that the wolf is representative of the witch, and it's showing
Hmm.
this is what we do to witch animals, but potentially also like this is a this is classic like fearsome guardian stuff, right? My doorman has bigger teeth than your familiar imps or what have you. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I think that was most of what I gathered. The Academy of Armory by Holm talks about how avarice and covetousness is usually depicted as a man with bags and chests of money, obviously, but also with a wolf with a lamb with his foot on a lamb and a goose by the neck in his mouth. So like mid raid kind of thing.
Mm.
Again,
Okay.
yeah, using the ingredients to, yes, stir the humors of the thing, but also being aware of when we are like the wolf, when we are unlike the wolf, when we are wielding fire, when we are tempering things, is interesting. Yeah,
Yeah, I
and
think of Wolf's Teeth, right? You're reminding me, what is it? Alcade, sometimes mistakenly listed as Polaris, but sometimes adopted as Polaris within the Behenian lists
mm,
of Lodestone and Chicory. Memory would be great. Lodestone and Chicory, the plants. It's like I've done this work before, but it's what is it? Put with wolf's teeth, and it makes you a proficient hunter.
Ah.
A power like that's just as far as wolf's teeth as charm ingredients of here using the tail of the great bear as the lore being that sometimes the tail of the great bear is listed as three hunters stalking the bear.
Mm.
And so to use that and the notion of who is the bear's only natural enemy is the wolf, is interesting there.
Yeah.
But I think that goes back to the original like Hermes on the 15 fixed stars. And I think it is translated into Agrippa in that way too, a wolf's tooth for Al-Qaid.
Mm.
Yeah, it not to beat on a dead horse, or a dead wolf, but there's also the conflation, right, of trickster lore in general, where there's a natural relationship or between the two types of wolves that you're saying, where one might more be fox-like or more coyote-like, and
Mm.
coyotes being what they are in the American, I mean, they're American jackals, right? Or like it's a helpful way to understand that kind of continuum of slightly less muscly, but still, wolf-like in some of its tendencies.
Yeah.
But the nature there of coyote um, is a natural bridge from wolf as beast to lizard as tonali as day sign,
Yeah.
um, because Quetzalcoatl is it's an okay day. I mean, the days, as we've discussed before, are always dependent upon the numbers that modify them.
Mm.
Um, but the notion that Quetzalcoatl is ruled by the deity known as Huehuecoyotl, or Old Coyote or Old Drum, but the day lizard itself, which is I think Can in Mayan uh, Tzolk'in, and Quetzalcoatl lizard in the Tonopuali of the Mexica. It's the reversal of fortune, so it's the quick turnaround of things.
Ah.
So it's a good day to extend your efforts to change people's opinions
Hmm.
through actions.
Mm.
So what you do on those days is said to magnify, but if you talk about it, it's just talk. So talk multiplies. That doesn't mean that the actual thing will happen.
Mm.
So it's one thing to do a sale on that day, perhaps, but the trickster nature of the day because of Huehuecoyotl ruling it, if you try and trick people, that kind of backfires. And Huehuecoyotl as a deity is filled with this. I mean, he's the deity of storytelling,
Mm.
and deity is a weird term, but Teteo, the gods themselves, quote unquote, as to like I saw a wonderful description by uh, a woman who's deeply involved with Mexica spirituality now described Teot as more snapshots of a moment in time that is then given like awareness and paraphernalia and ability to access that in the future, so
Mm.
that a point of abundance or the several life stages of corn, where you're not worried about just getting to the end stage of corn being fecund and bursting forth, but you're trying to nourish along the way. So there's so many deities and festivals of all the different stages of corn because we're trying to guide it along the way to get to that end result, that with that kind of magical recognition of breaking things up into accomplishable bits,
Yeah. Yeah.
or
Yeah.
performance narrative, right, of going back to Stanislavskian idea of beats, which is just bits with a Eastern European accent, but that it's breaking things down into small things so that you can have a meta objective that then falls into place.
Mm.
And so Huehuecoyotl is storytelling, music, dance. He's orgies. I mean, he's generally a fun-loving deity that is from the Tezcatlipoca kind of family.
Mm.
So there's related to all the trickster, shape-shifting deities. Generally, the you can avert evil fate, or fate that's really, really kind of coming at you in the hard way, by appealing to Huehuecoyotl, who can kind of turn things around, which this day sign reflects, and that's why it's on this day sign. The lizard also being things that like run away quickly or change color to their environment,
Mm.
but also if they are not. If they don't have smarts about them, we'll just get eaten by other things.
Mm.
So there's a constant need to kind of re-examine, look with both ways before you cross the street and understand the context for which you are unleashing something on a day that is Quetzalcoatl. Um,
Yeah.
so Huehuecoyot also has the thing of when he tries to do tricks, it often backfires on himself. So it's a little bit like Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner,
Mm,
that like
mm,
the more he aggressively tries to capture the Roadrunner, things just backfire on
mm,
him. Um, so he's considered to be a little bit of a shit stirrer, Huehuecoyot. So like if there's nothing to talk about, he'll make something to talk about. He'll go and tell someone, whisper in their ear so that they think that person's talking shit about them, and the other person, like, it's just he'll make wars between people because he's bored.
mm,
So it's a thing of like you have to indulge in this kind of prophylactic service of you got to have an orgy every so often, or else he gets pissed off and creates wars. Is really what it comes down to.
right.
So there's something interesting in that and the nature of the wolf that as far as trickster, coyotes tend to be a little bit more lithe, right? They get around they can escape the ravenousness, but they're definitely portrayed as like the hungry beggar cousins of
Yeah.
the ravenous wolf, across the mythologies that incorporate coyote.
Mm,
um, I was also, when I moved here to the Hudson Valley, when I saw a coyote here, I was like, this is what is wrong with this coyote, because I'm used to the West Coast where coyotes are a certain size, and I'm very familiar with them through my hometown. They'll come down from the mountains at dusk and packs anywhere from 3 to 20 and just go through trash cans, and like hopefully your cats and kids are inside. But and there's a you can hear the chorus. It's oh, the children of the night. Um, but the coyotes here were huge and tend to be apparently more solitary, like running in smaller packs. Um, and it's because they're interbred with wolves, so they're coy wolves here,
ah,
um, which is, blurring that metaphor even more, perhaps.
yeah.
So Quetzalcoatl there is, I like, again, feel free, anyone listening, go to azteccalendar.com. I recommend, because they have so much free stuff there. If you want a reading, Mi Corazón Mexica on Etsy, he does not know I'm promoting him. I'm just saying he does really good. He's done almanac work, and he's recreating a full almanac of based on his drawings around these things. But the calendar and him differ on which patrons they pull from for an individual person, and those reflections of who does what reflect the diversity within the kind of Aztec dance community and how things move.
Mm,
But both are, accurate in so much that these are just interpretations of your natal day. Your natal day is going to stay the same for the most part. Most of us use the Caso correlation, which you can read about, but that has to do with finding extant calendar keepers and going off of what they say the date is.
ah,
And especially for the fall of the city of Tenochtitlan, which we know the Western date of, and the date that's said to be on the calendar. So there's that. But who are famous people that are born on this day? Like actors, I mean, but that's also who they're going to list as famous people. But like Vanessa Williams, Adele, Kim Cattrall, Ava Longoria
mm,
um, type of thing. That was insulting to her. I didn't mean it like that. I just this group. It's interesting that there's so many actors that are listed as being born on that day. Um,
yeah.
I think the as far as a trecena, so these days cycle through, which I'll do an introductory video at some point. It's easy enough. But the idea that there's 13 numbers and 20 day signs, so this interacts into 260 different variations of, you have a day that's one lizard, two lizard, three lizard, four lizard, but they're not sequentially listed like that. In fact, because we're approaching it in this way, it's a good way to think about it of, this is our fourth episode talking about day signs. So we're at four lizard, basically. And next time we'd be at five snake, in March, because it is the fifth day sign we're talking about. And that's exactly how it wraps up, that after 13, which is the 13th sign, as I can't read, that it goes to Ocelot, which is the jaguar, but it starts over on one. So this offsetting of things means that you get these 13-day periods that are governed by the first day.
Mhm,
So the first quote unquote month of signs is grouped under Sipakli, crocodile, because it starts with one crocodile, say
mm.
Sipakli. So the Trecenas themselves have different bearings and have different vibrational wow, energies also wow. I'm gonna take a shot myself. But the things for Quetzalcoatl as far as the Trecena, they're it feels like rewards and punishments come from nowhere in this time period, which still reflects the kind of trickster nature of Huehuecoyotl. But
Mm,
it's not Huehuecoyotl that rules this period, but Lizard always has a little bit of that trickster like little coyote reference. So
Mm,
there's confusion. There people on the wheel of fate can spin either way. The if you want to figure out, you have to be quote unquote like the lizard and not be affected by the small stuff.
mm,
And always figure out how to climb back up when you fall. They're good days to kind of not draw attention, the 13 days of the lizard. They're under the patronage of a deity that's not talked about as much because it's a strange one, but and also perhaps because of names are hard to pronounce if you're not familiar with these things. But Itzlacoliuqui, Ishkimili but Itzlacoliuqui is snow, frost, cold, winter, sin, like privation. So it's an anthropomorphization of the curved obsidian knife, and is said
mm,
to be like the cold biting at the skin. So this is blind justice, objectivity. Like, have you prepared to get through the winter?
mm,
And it's funny because we don't necessarily think of Mexico as, but we're talking about the Central Plateau is higher up, and there's snow-capped mountains around there. So
mm.
the cold is not anything strange to them, to the Mexica, and certainly not to other cultures around. But the idea of you're going to come up against your reckoning here. It is a variant of Tezcatlipoca, so it's in that side. But we say that Iztacoyuqui was once the Huizcapantecutli, who is the Venus is the morning star.
Mm.
Yes, associated with Quetzalcoatl and other deity, because there's so many mythology groups coming together. The Aztecs, the Mexica, truly were the Romans of their area. Of like, you have a deity, we're going to incorporate it. You have a deity, we're going to incorporate it, and it might be kept as is, or it might merge with other ones, and it might hybridize in the way that most syncretic empires did this. Egypt, Rome, Greece. It's just the way it flows.
Yeah.
But they after a shooting match with the sun during the creation of the world, the morning star was basically to see who was brightest, right? Of like who's gonna outshine each other.
Mm,
And the myth of it is that after he lost, he was punished by the current sun, Tonotia, to become Itzlacoriucli, the god of stone and coldness. Like you don't
mm.
get to shine as bright now. Um, so it's an interesting deity for a lot of things, for coming into winter here, of what that is. Like the death is already associated with coldness, right? Because
Yeah.
to be alive is to be hot.
Yeah.
And this notion of heat, and we can talk about maybe humors, or we've talked about humors before, I think. But like ideas of polarity and heat and cold, and how these play into cultural examinations of deity classifications, as well as actions that you can use said deities for, and the plants under them, and the magical systems and substances under those deity is activating or deactivating, but also heating and cooling. And
Yeah.
so this notion that justice comes in cold, that blind justice is about seeing who's on the side of truth here. You're not swayed by emotions, you're swayed by this person committed the crime, they are therefore guilty.
Right.
And the necessity of objectivity comes in with this deity of frost and winter. He lost the match, therefore he is now the judge of everyone.
Mm.
Um, and it's interesting that this comes in pairing for the Trecena of Quetzalbalin with Huehuecoyotl being this I am the day. So the day is within, what's the expression? The days were long, but the years were short.
Yeah.
That's a similar thing of like Quetzalbalin is an interesting day, but better it be 2 through 13 Quetzalbalin, because one Quetzalbalin starts the Trecena, and that's a whole bunch of thing of like, let's just keep quiet for now. Let's not upset anybody. Let's not see if the deity of objective truth and winter and punishment and sin is going to be like, it is you. And the thing about that, it was, as it was described to me by a danza teacher once, was like, if we're looking into the obsidian knife, which is obsidian is also a mirror. So the deity that punishes in this way, that sets the whole like Tezcatlipoca goes from trickster to like, I will kill you.
Mm,
You will reap the benefits of your own sowing, as it
mm,
were. Is that it's a mirror, right? That obsidian is a mirror, and so
mm,
Tezcatlipoca has one as a foot that mirrors creation back to the world of I am what you think I am, and therefore the enemy on both sides, and like there's no winning.
Mm.
But also with this particular complex of they both belong to the Tezcatlipoca complex, but that here the very face of the deity of frost and cold that rules over the Trecena of Quetzalbalin is a mirror, and you are aware of what you have done and whether or not you've prepared. And so there
Mm.
is all it is doing is shining back to you that which you have failed at.
Mm.
Um, and that is an important side of it, of the kind of concupiscence that's described within Catholicism, perhaps of like, you know, when you're fucking up. We call it a conscience or whatever it is, but you knew there was a point in your argument where you knew you were going too far and that you might be hurting that person. There was a, and
Mm.
it was a choice to engage further. And I step back from the moral judgment of that, but there is a point in my experience in my own body where I know where I'm going too far, or I'm overindulging, or I'm choosing not to show restraint. There is
Mm.
a physical point of recognition of that, and the balance is tipping.
Yeah.
And that interests me with this. It interests me with Quetzalbalin, of the little lizard that could, right? The anoles that climb along the walls, the iguanas
Mm.
that sun themselves, um, and climb the trees in Miami, and then the frost comes and they all fall from the trees and can't move. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, that's Quetzalbalin. Did you
Yeah.
see anything in the research there that stood out for you, or I'm sorry, I kind of info dumped.
No,
Um,
no, never apologize for your input dumping. It's neurodivergent love languages, right? Um,
yeah.
no, I'm fascinated and taking notes on how to pronounce things. There was this repeated theme I read in a couple takes on it on blogs online and stuff about comparing this thing that you mentioned of like lizards that don't suffer great injury from a high fall because they're so small.
Yes.
But the importance, if we're going to learn from it, especially if we are some form of warrior, but to be able to immediately recover and like return to our perch to sun ourselves again. And so again, this idea of like not just the rapid reversal of fortune in terms of like sometimes you fall over, sometimes you fall out of trees, but that like you can also reverse the damage from that fall, that you can return to get back on the horse again and what have you.
Yeah, absolutely. The thing with the Quetzalcoatl that's important is that it's always like these deities, both Huehuecoyotl and Itzcoyuqui, is like you can come back from them.
Mm.
You can, through writing your actions, through realizing you're overindulging, come back from them, and that's an important part of it.
Mm.
Um, so it is the again, you can fall, but how can you get back up again to see the vantage of what's coming?
Right.
Are you going to pay attention and be like, maybe you hide behind the leaf while you see if it's safe, as opposed to be like, here I am, world.
Right,
Um,
right, right. You're just a
so
little guy. Yeah.
yeah, and so it's interesting that people that are born on this day, there's a lot of things you can describe into it, but like it's better for them to go wary into life, that eyes will naturally be drawn to them to try and wait for them to fall. They will send
Mm.
them up highly and they will tear them down quickly.
Mm.
So public acclaim, or businesses where you're dependent upon the conflation of self with business, which is anybody with a small business trying to work Amazon, any of us in the occult industry, right? You're
Yeah.
like, you're your own brand, and that's very difficult.
Yeah.
But Quetzalcoatl even makes it notedly like, hey, on days where it's, your face is always going to sell things, doesn't matter what your face looks like. Being
Mm.
visible will sell things. Being visible will get your ideas out there. But with that comes the being visible means people now launch their arrows. And
Yeah.
so learning how to do that in accordance with natural time periods and things like that, which might set us up for the next topic.
Mm.
But learning I mean, I think that's ultimately what we're talking about, right? With the various evolutions of astrology, from ancient Mesopotamia and India and Egypt, moving out of that to like, how do we use what is being shown to us as the cycles, and how can we learn from that, to the Mayan, Olmec, Aztec, permutations of the same, of how do the interactions of these planets and stars, how can we create something from that that helps guide us? And I'm purposely trying to set it up now for planetary hours, of course. But yeah, there's something, the measurement of time and carving out something into set increments, however we do that system, in order to understand the kind of the bits of the day, the
Yeah.
beats of the day, Stanislavskian, of like, how do I accomplish a day 1 hour at a time? and how you accomplish an hour 1 minute at a time, and how you accomplish a minute 1 second at a time. And going from those things of we are so intrinsically bound to the system of planetary hours in the West and now the entire world because of the dominance of the West's imposition of time and how we measure it, that it's fascinating that it's not more known on the common parlance. Now, obviously, internet social media has changed that,
Mhm.
and there's so many versions of what these hours might be, but it's our very nature of 7 days of the week and 24 hours in the day, and that all come from the interactions of base 5 and 12 that became base 60 and Mesopotamian math and feng shui that is astrology. um
Hmm. Hmm.
but I love that it is such a shock even to people that I love the shock of introducing mutable hours, lengths of hours. The idea of a set hour of time as something that had the same amount of time within it,
Hmm.
it's very new.
Right.
Um
Qualitative
and
versus quantitative. Yeah.
yeah,
Then
and
the
that
establishment of public time, and that like an hour has to be 60 minutes, which have to be 60 seconds each.
yes. And that, even if we divide those, what are we measuring? Are we measuring 1/60th of an hour, or are we measuring something else that adds that by virtue of counting 60 of them equals an hour, which are two different approaches. And
Hmm.
certainly the earlier approach with planetary hours is to divide the sunrise sunset time in into 12, which then creates the hours, which depending upon your latitude can be very, very short for an hour during
Yeah.
certain times of the year. And already we have in moderate latitudes of quote unquote the European cradle latitudes of like where England, France, Spain, Italy, Greece, Germany, like there's not that big of a variance, right?
Yeah.
But the 40s, let's say.
Hmm.
And the notion of like hours that go from 40 minutes to an hour and 20 minutes in our modern length, but in dividing things up by 12, that the essential nature of it is that on a Monday at sunrise, that because it is Monday is owned by the moon, or rather that the Chaldean oracle dictates this and sets everything up, that
Hmm.
there is a relationship between Monday and even the name and how we do it as lunar, and therefore at sunrise the moon owns that first hour,
Yeah.
and then goes through a Chaldean oracle, which is based upon how close the planets are to us from apparent observation from a geocentric orbit.
Yeah.
Um, and
Descending from slowest and furthest Saturn to closest and fastest moon. Yeah.
yeah, and therefore that certain favorable attitudes are going to planetary hours becomes like mansions of the moon, a possibility of embracing astrological rulership, but without having to wait for complex elections.
Yeah.
And so doing something and it, because of being sublunar in our lives of being under the lunar realm, being considered, although you want to take into account astrological elections, being considered equal in most eyes, most times of you did this at sunrise on a Sunday, it's therefore solar. And
Yeah.
there's no debating that is this the best election? You did it at sunrise on a Sunday. It's hard to counter that.
Right.
Um,
Very, very, very solary. Right. Yeah. 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 And again,
so
that idea of like the available light, right? Beyond
yes,
just the sun as 1/7 of the seven wandering ones. Like that's the root of planetary hours, as you say, of like it's a planetary hour is a twelfth of the available day period, sun up to sundown, or the night period, vice versa, right? Um,
yes,
and so of course like it begins with the rising sun and the importance of light on things, or of the setting sun and of the sun in the underworld, I guess we could say.
yes.
Yeah, and so
And I would put it out there too that like at least and I have Roz Franco, I already mentioned earlier in this episode, to thank for putting this in my head at age 20, of just discussing ethnomathematics and the concepts of dealing with base numbers based upon bodily observation, right? Either counting by fives or tens or 12s.
mm,
Um, or base 60 or base 70, or these things that are interactions of older cultures. So if the Sumerians are base 12, right, they're using their thumb to count the interstitial phalanges on the other fingers. So you have four
Mm.
fingers with three noted spaces on each of them. So you're using your thumb to count to 12. So it makes sense that rather than think of things in 10 like we might on a Western mind, or 5 in some cultures, that 12 is how they're going to divide things up. And
Yeah.
that and it therefore becomes something you can count on the hands. And that as they interact with another culture that is base 5, you can count with one hand and use the other, and to count 5 groups of 12, which ends up being base 60,
Mm.
which we know that's then that becomes the origin of 60 seconds, 60 minutes,
Yeah.
and so on, is ultimately being able to count this on your hands.
Mm.
Which makes it, for us, because we don't count the same way, becomes over complex and has to be something that we learn and internalize. But when you already are in that mode, it makes a perfect sense. It makes
Yes.
perfection on its
Yes,
own.
and it's very easy to talk about planetary hours as like, oh, the maths of dividing the day or the night period into 12s and like breaking that down with complicated maths, or with measuring where the when the sun hits, and with stopwatches and stuff. But the one of the points of calling them natural hours is that that's naturally about the 12th of a day, and that you could do this with your fingers as well,
Yes.
mapping like how far the sun has come up again with the fingers against the horizon. That there was a rule of thumb to being able to
Yes.
work this out. That's why farmers were using them. That's why it wasn't just the preserve of people with complicated abacuses or detailed ephemerides or things like that.
Yes.
Yeah. It's apprehendable by the very hands.
It's
Yeah.
yes. That is quote unquote ceremonial, as it makes it seem of like, oh, this is this greater order. The greater order is because it is folk from the beginning.
Yes.
Like there was
Yes.
this is unfolking it by taking it out of its cultural context, but it is there in the same way that like a certain finger width will determine how far something has moved, right?
Yeah.
That like when you think of the sun and the moon in the sky, hold your fingers up. They do not take up
Mm.
that much of the sky. And that is the first thing that we did in observational astronomy
Mm.
in college. It was like, let's learn what degrees are by the hand, because
Mm.
you will be shocked very quickly at how much, like, a little child draws the sun as at least 1/10 of the sky,
Mm.
and it is it is nowhere near close. So I like you said, planetary hours are a very basic thing to understand, right? There's going from lunar to this to the Saturnine, and it's easy enough to look up like a Chaldean order and see how this goes. But essentially, it's sunrise on Monday, it's lunar; on sunrise on Tuesday, it's martial; on sunrise on Wednesday, it's mercurial. The other side of this that I have asked and have talked to people about many times, because it's not, the parlance is not there anymore, of referring to two what is it when they're at the same time? There's 2 weeks going on at the same time. I'm just going to use the the phrase and not the fancy word that my brain died on, but that Saturday, right, turns is actually Wednesday at night. And so when we talk about night hours, and
Oh, yeah.
and then how it goes, that because of the order of the planets, right? So what it's going to effectively be, right, is going through Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, solar, Venusian, mercurial, lunar, and then starting over.
Hmm.
And that means the first and the eighth hour are identical to the name of the day.
Yeah.
However, by the time you get to the 13th hour, right, Saturday is Saturday. At night, it is literally a Wednesday night, because it starts with the hour of Mercury in the 13th hour.
Right.
And that there is, you have to make sure in some examples, by and large, most people just assume that it's Monday. In the same way that I ask, what day is it tonight? It could be 11:59, and depending on when you think the day starts, right? If it's 11:59 p.m. and I say, what day is it? Most people will go by the calendrical thing that we do of like, okay, today, this day that we are recording is Saturday. And
Hmm.
so it is still Saturday until it is midnight. And then it is Sunday. But it is not ruled by the sun until the sun has risen upon that day.
Right, right,
And
right. Are we measuring by sunrise or by sunset, which is again
yes,
a big division of calendricals in general, but also like yeah, common parlance. 2 a.m. on Saturday night is still it's the next day when I wake up, right? Like that kind of stuff.
yes, yes, and it's exactly, and the difficulty of this in ritual time across the board, that the Catholic Church considers Vespers to be of the next day. That
Mm,
they're following the Hebrew of sunrise starts, or sun starts at sunset. The day starts at sunset. So if you go to a mass at 4:30 p.m. or 4 p.m., which is a little early, but for the most part is likened to, that counts as your Sunday mass
mm,
if you went on Saturday for the vigil mass. And similarly, a saint's day starts on the Vespers the night before. And these are
mm,
often bigger celebrations than the day of.
right.
Um,
Agnes's
especially if
Eve.
yeah, exactly. Christmas Eve, Halloween,
Mm,
all these things that we already have in there. So there's something to that. I don't see them referred to as much, but Saturday is Wednesday, Sunday is Thursday, Monday is Friday, Tuesday is Saturday, Wednesday is Sunday, Thursday is Monday, Friday is Tuesday. And some of those are fun to think of, right? Where you have a Venusian Mars lineup on what we consider Friday.
mm.
Um, or even the mercurial sun lineup of our what we consider Sunday, or the harsh reality of what we consider Tuesday is Tuesday and Saturn night, ruled night.
Yeah. What was the did you say that which is the Thursday or which is the Jupiter and Moon one?
Jupiter and Moon is Jupiter is our Thursday, so it's Jupiter on Thursday at sunrise, and then first hour of sunset is going to be lunar.
Lunar, right. Yeah. That's an interesting one in terms of looking at the things that the specific hours are good for. The Hygromantia has a lot of stuff about both of the like the Jupiter for healing and the Moon for marketing for
Yes,
the market, the advertising, the selling of things. Yeah, yeah, which are all about how that there are galvanizing and down-regulating airs or a zeitgeist to a particular period of time, right? That times
yeah,
have a planetary flavor that's not dependent on the wandering stars' movement in the heavens. That like a lot of planetary hours are barely sky maths, right?
yeah,
If at all. And yes, the idea of like we're measuring cyclical time to, of course, know what to do next time it is this time, right? Next time it's the first hour of Thursday, what have you. But also about what happens next, right? And how this energy turns into that energy. The transits through them, to misuse an astrological term. And so that's really fascinating to me. Like you said, like the peak solariness of like the first hour of Sunday, right? The
yeah.
dawning of the sun, right? The alignment between the hour of the day and the day of the week.
Yes.
Like
Which
the
is generally the most considered the weightiest of it, right? Like we
Yeah,
still have the eighth hour, which is important, but starting anything on the planet's day at
right.
sunrise that's the shit. Like that's
Fresh
the
start. Yeah, yeah. That's what
yeah.
rules the rest of the day. The first being metonymically a representative or a ruler or an organizer or an influence on the rest of what happens next. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, yeah.
I enjoy to like okay, like so the Key of Solomon, I remember being fascinated with it. Hours of Saturn were good for summoning the dead in general, but not dead that had been killed, either in battle or by vengeance or like
Mm-hmm.
blood.
Mm-hmm.
So which there's is a medieval kind of in Renaissance and traditional astrology of the over obsession with how you die as one of the things it has to predict. And if you have a lot of martial placements, it's like you're gonna get stabbed or shot or
Right.
something. It's gonna be warfare. And like, okay, it's perhaps we reevaluate those prominences as we consider astrology moving into. It is less likely that most people are gonna get stabbed in the modern era.
Hopefully, yeah.
In yeah. But so like certainly with the hygromantia, right, of listing angels and demons. Um, we were talking about this even looking at Matt Hatfield's uh, book, which lists the charts out in very easy access, and that's great if you're interested in looking at like the beneficial and malign, I think is the term given to it, right?
Useless hours. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah. The
useless
hours to
versus
do.
do nothing.
Yeah,
That's what I was wanting to bring up, is like the difference between what is useless versus do nothing,
yeah.
because they are separate. So yes, you can look up, okay, I want to know the angel name and the day name. And we've talked about this with magical circles, right? That
Hmm.
half of doing it was making sure that you understood what you were accessing when you were doing the rite. Of
Hmm.
like, is the sun in, is it spring? Is it in this sign? It's this
Yeah.
name. It's this name here. These are the natural rulers of your time period. So you acknowledge them. You're giving obeisance to the natural forces that rule. And
Hmm.
now you invoke the spirit. But this otherwise thing of this is an hour that is useless, meaning it bears no fruit whatsoever, versus this is an hour of do nothing, as in everything you do will be not good, or because
Yeah.
there are bad hours.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like,
Where the main thing about it is what not to do,
yes.
as well as what to do. Yeah. Yeah. So this is interesting, right? Because we've got like that peak alignment. The day and hour of Mercury being often used for like making tools in grimoires. But then we've got this cross pollination of virtues of planetary day and planetary hour. So a Mercury hour on a Venus day combines the communicative qualities of Mercury with the amongst other things, the romance of Venus, and so it's sometimes said to be good for writing love letters, right, or communicating to a queen. And so, yeah, this in-depth schema gives us these. I think cross pollination's not a bad term for keying in. Like, okay, I know this is a Venusian work, but like, what are the different aspects of this Venusian work of art or of sensuality or of working with the fecundity of nature or of love? And being able to break that down includes what not to do sometimes. More commonly, there are like good for this thing, right? Good to sell goods, good to go before a judge, that kind of stuff. Lining up the galvanizing virtues of that period of time towards our endeavors and what we qualify as success.
Yeah. There's in looking through Matt's book of, just because it's lovely to just flip through something.
The
For
hours, yeah.
right, the first hour of Saturn, um, Saturn day, for harming your enemies and striking them with illness.
Mm.
And I think, the immediate thing it makes me think of is, I know we've talked about this before, but Vubuzu is the word in Oranian barbaric for morning is not the magician's friend. And I think it's very convenient that the cursing hour is sunrise on a Saturday, which in our culture is just like, who's going to be up? Um,
You got to really hate someone, right? You got to get up real
yeah,
early. Yeah.
that the first mercurial owned, or the first hour of night on a Saturday, our Western day of Saturday is owned by Mercury, so that's for discovering secret things. That's lovely. The moon for
Mm,
seeing, the second hour for seeing people long dead,
mm,
the fourth hour for teaching, and then going there. But it's interesting, right? Like the fifth hour for Mars. Under the angel Belariel and the demon Notas, of very malign hour,
mm.
very very bad, very bad. And the sun, the sixth hour of do nothing, it's a useless hour, and under the angel of Opiel and Mirku, and you go like, what is Opiel doing? Like, what kind of job is it that you're just like, it's do nothing? What do you do? What exactly are you doing here? Um, so
They're on strike. Yeah.
yeah,
It's
it's just
very
a weird,
important that people don't do things. It's all about the
yeah.
notes you don't play.
That's well, yes, John Cage, absolutely. Um, The rest are notes. But also, yeah, Volbuzu and Choyofakwe were always my two favorite go-to words in Iranian barbaric. Choyofakwe's do the great work, if I remember correctly, but Volbuzu is there. The 90s. Um, yeah. So planetary hour-wise, it's interesting because that becomes I guess, well, not interesting with the fucking useless word. That they make it easy to do things in supposed alignment with, beyond the kind of oft maligned and quoted uh, certain publisher books of the late 90s that would be like, may all astrological elections or circumstances be to my favor as I do this working. And you're like, don't think that's how it works. But then again, there are grounds for that in Vedic magic of like, as you pour sesame oil, that sesame oil repels the effects of negative elections
Yes.
and enhances the effect of positive elections at the time. So
Yes,
there is
it's a
grammar
great
for it.
yeah, it's a great idea to try and avoid shifting and conditions that are becoming deleterious. The issue isn't with the objective; it's with the means of doing that. Is that done as simply as just saying, "Not me"?
Yeah, may my will supersede the will of everybody else around me as I pray for spirit rape on the boy I want to.
Right, right.
Yeah.
It
Anyway,
feels a little bit like those the thing about like posting on Facebook saying that like I have hereby it's very free man kind of I have hereby renounce the option to use my images without my permission. And like that's not how the law necessarily actually works. Like unless it
no.
is, right? Like
I mean,
when
it
it
is for
yeah.
wills. You can sign a napkin and say, I bequeath this to you. And if your signature's on it, it can be counting as a will. But, um, that's why you get people drunk and ask for their firstborn. Um, that's some good demon tradition right there. Um, I
But
think,
yes, there's plenty of ways to to try and mitigate bad bad stars, right?
yeah.
DP Walker I think it's DP Walker and talks about one of the popes building like an astral fallout shelter that I think I've mentioned before that he's like told by his astrologers, and he's also writing things about how people shouldn't be doing astrology, but of course he's also consulting astrologers. It's very bad, and no one should do it except me. And so he builds a chamber and blocks off the light and has candles and lanterns and things to kind of create an artificial, which are, those lights are consecrated to the planets, and he's kind of drinks various like elixirs to mitigate the bad circumstances of this conjunction that's supposedly going to kill him, and even the servants are picked by their natal charts, not having anything that is going to exacerbate that condition. The idea
Mm,
of like avoiding bad times is super fascinating. Even the way that an astrological sigil made for a particular time that gathers the juice of that particular zeitgeist. There's also records in the early modern English stuff I'm familiar with where at the turn of the moon it will either stop working or it'll do something else. And so you have a save point, but how does that save point's energy, that battery of that particular good fortune, interact with the shifting of what's going on in the outside world? So you raise a great point about like there have been all sorts of ways, some of them incredibly complicated, and some of them perhaps needing to be a little more complicated for weathering those bad stars as well.
it's interesting because I can see the. I normally don't think about these transitions, but now they're just coming to me. Um, Keeping the ball aloft,
Mm,
mitigating circumstances to try and keep the on the upper end of things,
hmm
to keep that fire high in the air is our referencing previous discussions of Letizia and the homoform of Obara
Yeah.
Meiji. But this notion of one in quick code, right, of 1 2 2 2,
Yep.
of fire active and the other elements at least not active, if not inactive.
Yeah.
And this idea of the rainbow that it brings and the joy that it brings in
Mm,
its name, right, alone of Letizia. Um, this is a figure that is, I think, an interesting one because its nature is one that it by its name is invoked even without even understanding necessarily what it entails to maintain or what that invocation means.
mm,
Um, and I think I like the generative complexities of the nature of keeping the ball aloft, right? Of like, what does it take to maintain joy? Well, you can't be heavy about it.
yeah.
Like nothing can be held on to that long. It needs, this idea that worrying about things too much is a heaviness. It is we are specifically not Earth here. Um,
Right.
we are
Right.
we are just the thing that maintains aloftness, the balloon in the air.
Yeah, it's a
And
mobile figure. It's fleeting. Yeah, it very much
yeah.
evokes like Keats's idea of like bursting joy's grape upon the palate, right? In experiencing, it's already happened. It's passing, and passio is yes suffer, but it's also that which moves through and moves us. It is expressed. It passes through us. It ripples out. And for me, I think we talked about before. Like I read it as a watery figure. This rippling water. And therefore being associated with those flexing, flashing scales of Pisces. But it's also, as you say, it's also a fiery figure, especially in like Arabic ways of reading it, where it's like a spark of joy, the spark of inspiration, the spark of conversation between people, the beardless youth, the jawbone that flaps. But I think even and that's great because it like definitely evokes this sense of like we have this upwardsness of fire, right? It's that's even one of its like platonic qualities, right? Is that it's light and it's reaching up, light in the sense of not heavy. But even in its wateriness, it's not sinking water, it's not stagnant water like Ruvius, or expansive heavy water like Populus, or even like uh, water that's just moving, diagonally or like across, like Via's rivers. It's babbling brooks. It's fountains. It's the bubbly in the toasting flutes, right? It's water that's if not gushing, then at least like moving upwards again. The springs out of the earth and that kind of stuff.
Mhm.
Less transformative, rushing whitewater rapids or lazy rivers, which you also get with Via. But that which freshens rather than corrupts or carries us away.
And that's interesting because you bring a couple of things up where we're like, yes, because of the fiery nature of, the often the Arabic interpretations and the kind of um Odu interpretations have a parallel,
Mm,
perhaps a little bit more than we obviously see in some of the Western ones. But what I like about this is that you're talking about water that's taking on the nature of fire's elemental weight quality, right? Water that is seeking to rise, that is ascending it above its own weight. It is not giving into the gravity of Earth, which is
yeah,
how it would normally go.
yeah.
It is actually going out of its own container. It is transforming its container. It is
Mm.
transforming its own nature to go from water to rainbow, and therefore
Mm,
brings in notions of rain, right? Like as it passes through the air and gets to the fiery vault. Um,
yeah.
there's an Icarus type of thing right there, so it has to come back down. But the notion here of rain and fecundity and things like this, of that which freshens, what you just said, is really lovely. Of like, it's not water that brings mud. It is water that refreshes. It is the moistness of fresh attraction. It is the moistness of intrigue and curiosity. In the same way that it is, one of the criticisms of its like amazing potential, but you have to be careful not to reward potential in this sign, right? Not endlessly, especially. So
Mm.
in that way that you're shit until you're not type of mentality, it is. You have to actually do something with the rain if it's going to produce a long-term result. This is as you're talking about the zeitgeist that is the nature of the sign itself, right?
Yeah.
That there has to be a way to capture and contain this. And I like the idea of water being the container of that fire because it speaks to something different than just a momentary spark, which is really hard because the spark, in truth, which provides the way because of its brightness, to me is more via. Um,
Mm,
and the light in the east in that way, which is strangely primal fire sign in Ifa, right? Because it's the sun rising in the east, and
yeah.
complemented by the populace or Oyaku nature in the west. And again, I'm using these terms interchangeably, and you can come for me, and that's fine. I know how to separate these in my own practice. Um, but I do think the dialogue around these things is really lovely and important because it expands our ideas around what's the actual meat of this sign, and it can manifest differently in different cultures and through different readers' expressions. Sure, that is
Yeah.
important. Those variations make it a living tradition and prove that
Yeah.
it's being used and worked as opposed to resigned to, the Golden Dawn's revamping of, oh, look at this geomancy. Um, so I don't know why that's my voice for the Golden Dawn, but it kind of makes sense, I feel.
It
Um,
does.
so this notion of Obata being the Odu of business, of
Mm,
you got to wake up and move that stall around. Like if it looks stagnant, it's not going to capture the attention of new people.
Yeah.
And so you want people to be like, oh, it's the Barnum line, right? Of if you haven't been to the Barnum Circus lately, you haven't been to the Barnum Circus type of thing. Of like,
Yeah.
how do you redress this? How do you put a new label on it? How do you put new paint on it? How do you sell something old as something new without even lying about it? Because the one of the proverbs in this Odu is the king does not lie, and that is not
Mm.
about the king not being untruthful. It's that the king creates truth. The king is above and decides what truth is. So if you're going to decide what truth is, you might want to do something that is to your advantage and can be verified. So
Yeah.
again, you could do that deceptively, where joy is going to be fleeting because people are going to find out, and the shine is going to fade, and you have counterfeit and the transformation and the appearance of metals, like as discussed in Marcosius.
Yeah.
Um, or is it that no, I have actually now gilt this thing that was silver in gold? It is not solid gold, but it appears as gold, and you can therefore say that it is gold. You, my friend, have a gold ring.
Yeah.
And
Doing things artfully. Yeah, I like that. Yeah, that it's not just the veneer of something, it's the patina of things. It's the rearranging that does change, and like
Mhm.
art and delight that art wonder, all of these things are also heavily talked about in early modern European geomancies of Laetitia. Yeah, that it's keeping things fresh and evocative, or we might even say, stirring those passions in the onlooker. Lots of stuff about music as well. Again, the performance of things, right? Where is that a lie, and where is that an experience?
Yeah. I also think it's interesting to note, like, because we have to talk in Ifa so much about Megis, of the duplication of this sign, this energy, in order to
Yeah.
talk about it, because there's no such thing as like a half Odu, even though that's kind of what De Laguna is referencing in some ways. But
Mm.
that's a larger discussion. But Obarameyi, automatically has two kings. Like there is an imbalance and like an anticipation and a nervousness that comes in this sign, which is like which one's going to produce, which one's going to be victorious, and
Uh,
that way, that because of its doubling, brings out some of that competition and striving that isn't there when it's single, because you see that when it's modified by other signs, there's
yeah.
still this precariousness or joy or fiery nature that is modified by other signs,
Yeah.
um, but is when it's doubled by itself. So I think it's also an interesting thing to point out too, that in the necessity of discussing things through the most that they can be, which is in Ifa would be doubling itself,
Mm.
to have those two legs. Perhaps that's one of the reasons that we lose something in the translation too, between what is discussed as the single expression of that sign versus the doubling of it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, yeah. I mean, in again, in understanding the difference between these things, that Odoo have 256, because it's a combination of two of the 16 4-bit binary forms or figures. When we talk about adding something to itself in Western geomancy, it's always going to produce populace, right? It's always going to
Hmm.
produce if not a stagnation, then a sense of like when new things aren't really favored there, right? I think of how Laetitia is a Jupiterian figure generally, and speaks often of the jovial community mindedness of Jupiter on its day off, right? As opposed to the big blue bank manager or priest of Acquisitio, the other more formal Jupiterian figure, and that like Laetitia rules like the as well the patrons of the art, the chaste suitor, the perfect gentleman, the dependable artist, the Epicurean, the delighted amateur, right? Meaning one who loves a thing. But when you get two lovers of art, you get art criticism, right? You get the
Hmm.
back and forth of people like
Yes.
just talking about the thing rather than doing the thing.
Yeah. Which is interesting too, because you also get that in the notion too, that even in the mathematics of it, even though it not energetically, but the relationship between via and populace, or ogbe meji or yakun meji,
Mm.
being one is literally the double sign of itself, right? The way we mark inactivity is through doubling the activity.
Yeah.
Um, I'm not saying that those things are the same, but there's something interesting in that, also in the saying of like that the math itself will always balance to, we will get populace at some point.
Yeah.
With
Yeah.
adding things, you're going to flash between, something, but populace is going to come up. It is the receptor of darkness in which all the other figures are cast.
Right, it's the
Um,
continuance, right, with two Laetitias in a court, right, left witness and right witness. Of course, it's
yeah.
populous because that energy is still going. Now, you might get different iterations of it. You might look at like this is the good side of it, this is the bad side of it, but you're still dealing with a continuance of that thing rather than it stirring something. Which again, to this
Mm.
fleeting figure, this mobile figure is about, as you say, the making things feel new again, feel new, not just like look new. Um,
Yeah, and it's interesting to think of like the remedies for this too, within like Obara has so much of the instability there, which
mm,
we talk about that joy is fleeting, right? Like it's
mm,
not permanent. So it's this has to be cultivated, the flame has to be contained. But there's also this thing there of like what's the medicine symbolically that's interesting there for me as an Orisha priest of like if fire is the active point, and that's it's literally the head, right? In our
yeah.
anatomy of the figures,
Hmm.
the fire is there, that how can we extend that through the body? Head medicine then allows the flame to go back down through the whole body, and we illuminate the path through via. So
Mm,
if we can merge this understanding of joy with via, we might find a way to sustain the fire indefinitely.
mm,
Which is an interesting side of just pulling down the light through the whole body there, the body of the figure, and by extension, the body of the person.
yeah.
So, feeding your head to keep your mind clear, to make sound decisions that are not based solely in impulse and hedonistic expression and enjoyment,
Mm,
um, might allow the joy of Obata, yes, to be contained and therefore not quite the same as uninhibited joy,
mm.
but allow for more opportunities by which, through providing a foundation and a container, Carker, that you can then allow things to coalesce, conjunctio, and against the backdrop of your life, populace, and find the path direct in via.
Via.
Um,
That was amazing. I love that. Yeah. Oh, I'm glad we recorded
yeah.
this.
Yeah.
Yeah, a,
Oh
a
man, that was
sustainable joy, a contentment.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, Laetitia isn't about wild hedonistic excess. Like that's getting
Hmm.
into like Rubius territory where we are literally carried away by our blood and the boiling and stagnant blood of others. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. How do we draw that from the head to expand emotional intimacy, openness to new experiences, exchange of ideas, right? Yeah, 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 yeah.
What's interesting there too is that if that's Rubius, right, is that kind of hedonistic side, but that's drawing the fire down, but not keeping it in the head. You just moved it down to explore the rest of the body. That's now in the
Yeah.
throat. And
Yep.
so if you don't keep it in the throat, I mean, and then we can look at Fortuna Minor, Fortuna Major, and things going out in every direction from there. But like the notion of maintaining what you have so that you cannot spill it everywhere. How do you contain that light? That's the basis of how we do any of our magic, right? We're trying to contain the rays of creation into something that we can access later.
Yeah.
Language itself is an excellent example of that. If words have to both have a definition as well as be mutable and contextually understood in the moment,
Yeah.
which is determined through relationality, time, trend, new explorations, new words, but all those things have to be there because otherwise you're trying to force the light into the throat, which then it becomes words for words' sake, and it doesn't mean anything.
Yeah. As
And
opposed to the bridge between the speakers. Yeah.
yes. Yeah, absolutely. Where it truly the meeting mind of like when you're talking about the throat and the belly type of thing and conjunctio of like it doesn't matter, we can still understand each other even if we lost our head and our feet here.
Hmm.
Um, versus the container of Carker, which is okay, our head and like we have to have directions now.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter where your heart and your libido are at. I need to know that you understand what's being said. These are the instructions of Carcarian reach in that way.
Yeah.
And of course, these are mental blow-ups from yes living in this wonderful gray space of contemplating Odu and geomancy, and doesn't mean that it changes the body of the lore on either, but I like the aha moments because fuck yeah.
Hell yeah. 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 And again, what is feeding the inspiration and the breathing in of things as seeing the old and the established and the traditional anew and seeing those depths of mystery again, not as a thing to veil off, but as a continual renewable resource.
Yeah, yeah, and the Letitia quickly goes like Rubius and Albus in its expression, right?
Hmm.
As it goes down through the body, as it were, and down
As it
to
sinks.
Theseus. Yeah, as
Yes,
it
it's
sinks.
it's it's upside down. Yeah, yeah, yeah. The mirroring of joy and sorrow. Yeah, that it's upside down is Tristitia, which always makes me think of Gibran's thing about like the deeper that sorrow carves into your being, the more joy you can contain, right? Hollowing and
Yeah.
hallowing. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Hmm.
It was some beautiful advice when going through a breakup once that my friend Yvonne said was allow your heart to break open.
Mm.
Um, to break open was such a lovely like keep open, keep trying to be open through all of this and allow yourself to see what you can still contain. And it makes me think of like sadhana practice in Buddhism, right? Like you dissolve your I don't identity into the deity, and then eventually you dissolve the deity and you rest in nothingness.
Yeah.
It's this constant openness to the permeability. There's something there. I think that might be an easy playing between Rubius and Albus and this permeability and overturning and upturning and all these things, the containment of something that is in the Ace of Cups.
Yeah.
Because we are exploring minor arcana. So it's interesting because there's the tarot meanings, there's the playing card meanings, and for me, heavily the thing that kind of bridges those two anyway in my head because of the simplicity of drawing things as if they're in tarot that exists in Baraja Española. But I suggested or proposed Ace of Cups because in Spanish card order, it is the second thing.
Mm.
It is the directly under the coins. Coins being the ruling class and cups being the priestly class.
Mm.
Um, so again, back to the monks and the lamocracy. But the cups themselves, I'll go through Spanish cards and then we'll like bring it back to tarot, I suppose.
Yeah.
Like La Pinta has one break, so there's this one little break of things to trickle down from the gold. Like it still funnels into the cup. It's still a very rich um, part of everything. But this is the table, the hearth, the home is all in the cups. Religion and clergy is there. Love
Mm.
and high
Hmm.
emotions at that, not
Mm.
like not destructive passions. But yes, love and jealousy are there. Creativity, fertility, legacy, nostalgia are all there. It's hard to not, of course, draw parallels to the Holy Grail there, right? So the as de copas is the serpent of water, is justice and the law. It's the table, therefore it's the altar in the church, but it's also the home table, the nest. So this home, the altar, it is, and reversed is typically of change, just change itself, because you have now changed the state. What was once now contained is now outpoured, and you have to modify it to find out more information. It is not, oh, it's change of home, change. It's change. Figure out what it is now. But in this way, we have saints associated with the Aztec copas of like Santa Marta, Saint Gabriel. It's funny going back and forth between English and Spanish. San Luis Beltran,
Mm.
and San Juan Evangelista, the Saint John the Baptist. It's weird what my brain decides to say in English versus Spanish. I apologize. If anybody hasn't seen the redux of the Animaniacs country song, but with saints in Spanish, it's very good.
Red thread.
And I may have to, yeah, Red Thread, exactly. I may have to do a cover of it. But yeah, so just states like Saint Martha is interesting here, right? Of because she carries the brazier with her, sometimes the cup with her, but she is got the tarasca on containment here. So the nest is the house is the thing, the part of nature that you learn to control. Within your four walls is your own New Jerusalem, and that by extension, as the church tries to ward off the evils of the world, the house tends to ward off the evils of the street and the city, that you might have a place of respite and rest. And
Mm.
so the Ace of Cups has to deal with imposing law, imposing justice. Under my roof, these are my rules. And
Mm.
it allows you to then eat at the table and get sustenance because of the rules. So there's always this relationship between sacrificing a little bit of liberty so that you can get reward, and therefore the parallels between home life and living a good Christian virtuous life so that you can get into heaven.
And
Um,
community in general, right?
yes, yes, to gather round in that way.
Mm.
But you do get the like John the Evangelist, as well as Louis Beltran are both serpent cups or dragon cups, right? Expelling poison. So there's this relationship there with
Mm.
getting of purifying of the unicorn putting its horn into the fountain. This is Ace of Cups and very strong energy. Gabriel coming to Mary as the chalice
Mm.
Wiccan ceremony of the Annunciation and the impregnation and the overshadowing by the Holy Spirit that allows for the throne of Mary to let little Jesus sit on her. Um, but yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
that's funny. My headphones are like, we are tired and we will no longer work for you. So I apologize for my vocal change. But yeah, so that's the Ace of Cups. It's a lovely bunch of mysteries in and of itself. But I don't think it's in direct contrast to, but slightly just sideways of the traditional tarot associations.
Yeah. 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 Some real more specificity and grounding it a lot more in like lived life than the aces and tarot writers and magicians and I guess especially mystics do tend to emphasize the mysticisms, right? The holiest mysteries of phlegmatic virtues, which yeah can be yeah we can talk about like the abstract takes on fecundity of nature, the waters that break for new life, the deeps that the darkness moved over. But again, like for the phlegmatism of it, like reflection, imagination, and maybe arguably the moistures of the humors, the things that are moist, right, themselves. I would argue, yeah. But we still get um, like old old deadweight talking about the beginning of great love, joy, contentment, productiveness, fertility, beauty, and pleasure. But also, again, has to bring it back to the spirit, right? A reminder that when the mind is filled with spirit, the spirit will fill the material cup to overflowing. Um,
Yes. Yeah, there's I remember the first time I ever heard, when the student is ready, the teacher will appear was because this cup overturned for a friend. This card overturned for
mm,
of like, creating the container. You can't be so closed and pretend like I'm going to be in geomantic metaphor right now. That's weird. You can't be so closed off as that nothing can be poured into your cup, right? So you can't we do have rules which creates the table, the carcer of containment there,
yeah.
but you have to be able to receive in the same way that you're talking about Justicia carving out the possibility of more joy.
Mm.
You have to have something to be filled. And if your cup is already full, what is it? Why are you seeking a teacher? What are you seeking there? Uh,
Right. This is Bruce
Validation?
Lee, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So
Exactly.
there's something there. Yeah. Yes. New beginnings. And the aces are interesting in general, right? Because we talk about potential for things and the kind of,
Is it 1 or 11? Right.
yeah, is it the Katerian as in Kether, expression of something where it's not quite formed, so it needs more guidance and it's tenuous and it is, as it's a noetic, it's there in the noose.
It's perfect in the planning.
Yeah, but it needs, much like we talked about with Letizia, of it needs more of a container. It needs something there
Mm.
um, to hold it. And here, it is the Ace of Cups, not the Ace of Wine, not the Ace of Blood, not the Ace of Water. It is
Yeah.
associated with water, but it is a cup that is being virtue signaled here. Um, so
Yeah.
that's interesting. The the notion of toasts and things like that comes to play, but that would come in obviously more with like two and especially three of cups.
Mm.
Um, and we'll get there because we got a lot of minor arcana to flow through. But I love the notions of this card, and the um even the overly Catholic imagery that can come of like the blood of Christ as to what this is, and the salvific force of in the right context, in the right way, um,
a simple cup shared with others. That the priest is one cup for many members of the congregation. Uh,
Yeah, yeah,
that
yeah,
defining unity that is still done there, not in that it can be joyous, but it's not needed that everybody has their own cup. There's a communal nature.
yeah. This is what the Ranters talk about explicitly in their anti-formalism, that the true host is bread broken around the table, that the true blood of Christ is the cup of wine that's shared. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Hmm.
that's where we see again the nest, the table, the home,
Mm,
this importance of delineation so that you can decide yes, us versus them, which can be the negative side of this. All the bad side of family dynamics are born from this um, ace manifesting through all the other numbers,
mm,
but also the joys of that as well.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
that childbirth is such a thing here, right? We're talking about fertility and fecundity and the Annunciation. It's
Hmm.
not like any of that's going to be easy.
Right.
It's not like Mary only had seven joys. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah.
I like this emphasis on like emotions as actually felt. Um, uh, Again, yeah, that makes a lot more sense to me in terms of like, reading for people, in and about their lives. I guess, I mean, if you're reading for magicians, then, citing Crowley talking about the dark sea of Bina might be useful for them. Um, but yeah, what does this look like in the world?
Only
Um,
in the sense that the map is not the territory, right? Like, how can this be something that you don't just memorize and refer
hmm,
to limit your experience, but rather to perhaps help label, comprehend, or share your experience?
yeah,
And
yeah.
so I think this emphasis on the container is something interesting to think about. Certainly, it's a big emphasis in the acting training I have and the kind of theater philosophy there. It also makes me think of as a natural progression into because apparently I'm just driving them home. Um,
We're flowing.
in going to Arthur Gauntlet,
Mm,
it's an interesting one because it's the Grimoire of Arthur Gauntlet, right? There are a few names it's known under, but like primarily, especially post, I think what was it, 2010, 2011, when David did the version that is most known now.
yes.
Um, so David Rankin, hi, thank you for everything you do. And just also a lovely person.
Yeah.
Um,
Good
but
egg.
the Grimoire of Arthur Gauntlet, which is a quote unquote 17th century cunning men's book of charms, conjurations, and prayers. And the container of this, like grimoires are always containers, right? They literally are the grammary of how do we do the spell.
Yeah.
And I picked that word for a reason. But this in particular being the grimoire of a specific London cunning man.
Hmm.
And yes, his work with is it Sarah Skellhorn?
Yeah. Skelhorn or Skelton sometimes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And that there's lots of things from like the Arbitel and the Heptameron, and there's like as many notebooks are pulled from
Hmm.
many sources. But what I love about this particular exploration is because we're not just talking about the grimoire here. The grimoire itself references the notebook of the magician,
Yeah.
who in this case we can be fairly sure existed, um,
Yep.
which is already different from many of our dead magicians.
Yeah.
Um, and I like that this automatically allows for, and I know this might not seem a stretch, but it is really important to emphasize that the authors of grimoires are dead magicians that you can contact for which to perhaps understand more about their grimoires.
Yep. Yep.
Even if you don't know their name, but knowing their name is of exceptional help. So I will stop my rambling introduction, which is to say that I know that you have much experience and thoughts on Arthur, the bear son,
Right.
and his gauntlets.
Hmm.
So I leave you to info dump all over my face.
Hooray! I love it. Yeah, I think that's a great introduction, right? Like we do know most about Gauntlet from his book, and that this is a working book, right? This is which again is a kind of as I was talking with Douglas of What Magic Is This, like a working book is a kind of grimoire, but you can also think about grimoires as a kind of working book that they
Yes.
contain That it's a mixture of, yes, the actual recipes and stuff he used. There's also vast tracts of stuff. We'll get into that. So we know most of like what he was doing, and that's actually mostly what we know about him from the historical record I've come across. There is a very short reference to him in the history and life of William Lilly that he writes at the request and patronage of Elias Ashmole, which again I've categorized before now as magicians I have met and disapproved of. He talks. He has almost a throwaway line about. I was very familiar with one Sarah Skelhorn, who had been speculatrix, which again is a word we should bring back, unto one Arthur Gauntlet about Gray's Inn Lane. And this is all he says about him. A very lewd fellow, professing physic. And then just talks about Sarah again. This Sarah had a perfect sight, and indeed the best eyes for that purpose I ever yet did see. Gauntlet's books, and even Lily, even this one main reference we have about this dude also comes down to his books, right? Gauntlet's books, after he was dead, were sold. After I had perused them to my scholar Humphreys, there were rare notions in them. And that's what he has to say. He then goes on to talk a bunch more about Sarah. And so what we have is, a mid-17th century cunning man living in London around Gray's Inn Lane, which becomes Gray's Inn Road. He's called Lude, and he's said to be professing some kind of physic. This does tell us a bunch of stuff about cunning folk and about a couple things, right? So for a start, he's in London. He's in what's now Camden, Gray's Inn Lane. And while there's a lot of secondary source material on cunning folk as more rural, there are lots of like urban folk magicians in around and in early modern Britain. They are a little different. It's easier to see sometimes the rural ones who, as Owen Davies has pointed out, often played like more important roles in a smaller community. But they're also doing their thing. It's different as it's navigating a different set of clients, a different set of concerns, a different bunch of like actual geography. Tabitha Stanmore does a wonderful job in both of her books, especially more recent one, Cunning Folk, on showing the differences of how urban cunning folk were often more specialized. She has a wonderful account of a lady who loses, I think it's spoons, and goes to a variety of different cunning folk in and around London who are basically like, oh, no, that's not my speciality. You want them down the road that does finding lost goods. I do more love leashes or court case stuff. And I think it's important.
Recommendations from other workers? Never.
Imagine. There might be enough clients to go around for everyone. And it might be a good thing to be able to say that you can do a couple things well, as opposed to trying to do everything less well. Imagine that. Yeah. Professional courtesy and referrals and recommendations. Yeah. It's also just, I think, there is a lot of, in looking at cunning craft, there's a tendency to slip into a wider pastoral about how this land used to be full of enchantment, right? Wonderful article on this by Lauren Cassell, This Land Was Full of Fairy, about like, looking at pre-modern times when everyone was doing magic all the time, and I say pastoral as an idyll because there's also often this emphasis on like the people who could, talk to the trees and who were like more, land than person. And sure, you do get like accounts like that, but you also get folk magicians who were making a living in Gray's Inn Lane, a bustling place. It's the thoroughfare. We first get a record of it in like the 13th century, where it's part of Portpool Manor and gets called like Portpill Street as a result. By the time, it's purchased by the first Baron Grey de Wilton, Reginald de Grey, purchases it, and he gives his name to Gray's Inn, which is founded on the street. By 1468, the road's known as Gray's Inn Lane, or it's all one word, like a good, weird band is, Gray's Inn Lane. By the early 19th century, there's a map around the start of the 1800s, which caused the whole stretch from Holborn to what's now King's Cross, Gray's Inn Lane. By the 19th century, that's solidified as Gray's Inn Road, which is what it's called now. The important thing about this geography to mention, because it gives us a context for what Arthur's doing and the space he's doing it in, is that Gray's Inn isn't just a pub. Gray's Inn is also called the Honourable Society of Gray's Inn. It's one of the 4 Inns of Court, capital I, capital C. These are professional associations for barristers and judges in London. And of those 4 Inns of Court, they, I think, remain the only bodies legally allowed to call a barrister to the bar, at least in England. England and Wales, actually. And they are... their halls, and their training places and their schools for the legal profession. They from 1597 they have these what they call the walks, these huge like gardens, and they're a bit like quads. It's not exactly mirrored like a university, but it's certainly not just a tavern. Is my point. It's believed that the Comedy of Errors is first performed in Gray's Inn Hall, for instance. So there are halls and things like that associated. So they're kicking off and pretty profitable by the turn of the 17th century. The outbreak of the First English Civil War very much disrupts legal education and governance, as it disrupts a lot of other things as well, and actually shuts down all the calls to the bar and new admissions. And it's sometimes said that Gray's Inn itself doesn't necessarily really recover. It's doing fine right now, but it ends the older traditional forms of legal education and then kicks off. So all that's to say is that Gauntlet is practicing his urban cunning craft in a space that is full of legal students. Some judges, some like movers and shakers, but also people who have been like he's operating in like the 1650s, and so this is after the first Civil War, at least in that kicks off in like 1642. But you've got this changing of the regular way of making truth and of training to be a professional in those capacities, and so that's the area he's kicking around in. There's some interesting stuff about Gray's Inn having interesting to me at least because it's heraldry. They have a gold griffin on a black background. I can go off on tangents about that if we want. So we know where he's practicing. We know what his books are, and we know he's practicing with Sarah, who's again said to have the best eyes in the business. She's acting as his seer. Lily tells us a lot more about how she used a crystal and would always begin her calls by good angels only and only, which is probably a reference to like them being solely good. But there is a particular spirit that we find in 16th century stuff who is called Only as well, Only, Onely generally. So there's a reference to that as well. She talk about Sarah. She probably deserves her own dead magician slot at some point. So, as I say, what we know mostly about Weird Uncle Arthur is from his grimoire, which is Sloane Manuscript 3851, or contained therein. Again, yes, thank you, David, for publishing that, the edited version. It's a working book, which means it contains stuff that he's found in other books that he's found useful. It's his hard drive, so to speak. That includes stuff from the Folger Book of Magic, from the Heptameron, from both the 3 books of occult philosophy and the 4th book. The 4th book, like, makes sense. There's a bunch of, like, how you make sigils, how you make your own pentacles and stuff, like the of magical ceremony stuff. But there's also, like, chapters of, like, occult theory, of, like, occult philosophy in there. So it's worth pointing out that, yes, a working book is your book to do work, but that work might also include thinking about things. There's also extracts from Scott's Discovery of Witchcraft. There's Psalm magic that's also found in Lansdowne Manuscript 1202 and seems to be drawn from the same source as the Book of Gold, the French 17th century book of Psalm magic. There's texts from Sloane 3846, which includes a version of the Sefer Ratziel. There's also stuff taken from Additional Manuscript 36674, which is where we get the excellent book and its visions, as well as a couple different keys of Solomon that are in there. It also exerts a version of a 16th or 17th century arbitel, like he pretty much writes out the whole of the arbitel, but it's not quite the same. There are interesting editorial choices in specific language and things. There's also stuff from books called things like A Right Profitable Book for Disease, and even the 1622 Book of Experiments out of Diverse Authors. And it does include a bunch of go through contents, but it's worth pointing out that he is doing healing, right? He's not just professing physic in the sense of like trying to do healing stuff, along with, you know, charms for love, for gambling, for protection, for invisibility. There's a lot of healing charms, and they're classic folk magic stuff: stopping bleeding, against toothache, against the falling sickness, agues and fevers. There's a ton of scrying operations, which also demonstrate this kind of modular conjuration that's kind of implicit in some earlier like 16th century stuff, but is very much made explicit that like this is the prayer to call the three good angels into your stone. This is the prayer of purification beforehand. These are the psalms you say. Once the angels are in there, here is the petition for them to show you the thing you want to see. Then there's a bunch of other conjurations, very much if you do this, then this. If this is happening, this, like flowcharting it, of how to actually reach out and touch those things. To not just find lost property, to return it, to not just diagnose a patient, but to cure them, to find treasure. And this is done not just with a crystal, but also, interestingly, with a glass of water, which is always fun. And how you manipulate that object, what you put under it and over it to do different things with different spirits. As I say, there's a bunch of psalm magic in there, preparations for exorcisms, blessings, and so on. Speaking it over things, writing it out on a plate with wine and stuff like that, as well as the things you say and then burn to do particular exorcisms, links explicitly to like Tobias and Raphael and fish guts. He's even amends one of those with a lovely little image, like picture of a fish, like a little doodle about like burning fish guts to get demons out, which he has an aside line about how he did this to much laughter. And merriment was made. There are anti-thief workings, such as the four demon bishops of the cardinal points. There is, you know, being called a bawdy fellow, there is a lot of works, quote, for the accomplishment of the pleasures of the flesh. But there are also a lot of unbewitching workings. Hot take on a bunch of seething work, adding oil of pompilion, poplar buds, to things that are sometimes boiling away the patient's urine, as well as things that we would now call like witch bottles and stuff like that, of like containers for things. There are a lot of operations of planetary angel magic, images and talismans as well. There's pentacles and seals, like examples of like this does this, as well as instructions on how to make your own. There's a ton of perfume, what he calls perfume, but like suffumigation recipes. There's a bunch of outright necromancy, quote, you know, to have the spirit of a dead body. There are not just conjurational procedures, but actually advice. Yes, there's prayers, circles, purifications, bonds and charges and so on. But there's also like a lot of instructions on like how to do, not just what to do, but like what to bear in mind when doing it, shall we say. As well as like specific conjurations of devils and how to have conference with fairies. There are, again, spirits that we find in a bunch of the 16th and 17th century stuff, operations for Baron, Baal-Phares, Oberion or Oberon, Sathan. There are a lot of operations with apples. I've counted like 18 distinct ones, mostly for love and lust, but also a lot of operations with Vervain. Like he can do a lot with a little. There are also some operations for Valerian that look a little bit like some of the other earlier operations for like marrying Valerian. So it is like a patron plant to you, which includes like how to grow it, at least how to find it and how to harvest it. Yarrow is another one that crops up a fair amount. And then there are just like a ton of like little folk charms and image magic using personal concerns and animalia and a lot of barbarous words and characters. Throughout all of this, he is not infrequently citing where he's getting this from. Not always, which, you know, is frustrating to historians a little bit, but he's definitely citing the authority of great magicians. Solomon, of course, he points out where sometimes where he's quoting like whole sections from Agrippa. He also cites the authority of Saint Cyprian in a good couple workings, in an exhortation, like an exorcism, and also the instructions of Cyprian, which again are more about like how to do magic, right? What to bear in mind when you're doing it. As well as occasionally citing works by William Bacon, astrological works from John Searle, and even referencing that he got some particular charms from one Captain Bub, who Lily also mentions was a guy operating in Lambeth Marsh at the time, who resolved horary questions astrologically, who he calls a proper handsome man, well spoken, but withal covetous, and of no honesty, as will appear by a story he tells, for which he stood upon the pillory. So again, he's getting his stuff from magicians who are not necessarily always above and beyond the law, shall we say? And it's a treasure trove of early modern English cunning, and I would say like the examples of where he's at and what he's doing show that yes, there are specializations of urban cunning folk, but he has a wide purview as well, and that is he just professing physic, or is he actually practicing it? There's, as I say, there's a lot of healing stuff in there, as well as it does seem perhaps a preponderance of works of love and arguably especially lust as well, which vary from the outright erotic malefic to the more kind of like seductive and even like courting kind of stuff. Yeah, there's so much in it. It's and to be able to see how he's arranging stuff, which again, it's a working book. Paper is sometimes short. They aren't always divided up into clear sections, but there are parts where like, oh, he got hold of a bunch of psalm magic here and just copied as much, a bunch of it out. And so, yes, structure is important, but as is like the wider content and how things are relating to each other. As with many working books, there's the occasional reference of like, oh, see the stuff on Psalm 51 that I talked about earlier, and that kind of thing. There's a mixture of saying like, at this point in this conjuration, do this psalm. There are other points where he actually has the psalm out, so this was probably what he was holding while he was actually doing it as well. And again, that flow between working book as a reference script and as a tool itself is really interesting to me.
That's great. I guess my only curiosity is past this, because it's always interesting when we talk about the style of a dead magician. We have an extreme example here.
Yeah.
What have you, are you willing to discuss what you have found, and if more personal discussions about what it's like to contact or work with Arthur Gauntlet apart from the grimoire?
Oh, for sure, yeah. Yeah, I've been increasingly open about the fact that I chat to him. He was not the hardest spirit to find. Again, like kind of praising this against what we were talking about with like how important is it to know the personality of a spirit versus what they'll do. Is different in the case of ghosts and dead magicians, right? It's not just a purview or an office in a spirit list. He was a person first. So again, predicating that his personality might say as much about me and my styles of doing things as it says about him, and that other people might have different experiences. Yeah, he's a very lively spirit. I conjured him initially through some help from a dear friend in London who went and gathered crossroads dirts from Gray's Inn Lane, a road as now, and depending on how you measure it, there are 7 of them. Funnily enough, so a good number of a metonym of everything, right? So getting the place where he haunted, which is also partly inspired by looking into a bunch of the kind of folk eschatology that, say, John Hayden talks about in Harmony of the World, where he talks about how some dead folks aren't asleep, but are wandering around kind of retired, kind of watching what's going on with the living, like it's their stories at the retirement home, and that some of them don't just watch, but actually will assist, especially living people pursuing the things that they themselves loved in life. That the unfinished business is just the love of your craft sometimes. And so with his book and with alliances with other necromantic spirits that can facilitate that stuff, and with these dirts that my friend gathered. Thank you very much, Danny. He it was not I was surprised how easily he turned up. He was very ready to talk. He had and still kind of has a pretty filthy and provocative sense of humor. The difficulties I had with working with him initially were not that he was aggressive, but excitable, easily straight off task, got carried away. Again, this might say a lot more about me than it does about him, but a lot of the work was about getting him to focus on things. I did and continue to consult with him to learn his crafts and to get the most out of the book. He's great to go to about like, what do you do in this part of the thing, but also to try and have some like professional consultation about how to be a more effective cunning man myself. And that stuff was and remains really interesting. He often emphasizes word of mouth reputation, various ways of attracting clients, yes, but like remarkably practical stuff. One of the first things he said when I asked about this was like, who's talking about you in pubs? And this sense of what does it mean not just to be of loved or famous, but like known to be able to do the job. And that continues to be really interesting when he doesn't recommend, oh, here's this spell for that, when he's actually talking about like, quote, mundane strategy and that kind of thing. I found he has a great respect and even kind of fearful reverence sometimes for medieval magic, even though maybe because his expertise is often more in like folk charms and recipes and stuff. Again, in the early days of trying to keep him on track, I've appealed to Albertus Magnus before now, who have also got Tomb Dust from Cologne, to kind of sober him up somewhat. Found relationships with other cunning women, a good balance to a lot of his kind of bawdiness. And he also professes to be a devotee of Saint Cyprian. He's responded really favorably to work done before Cyprian and on Cyprian's feast days. And again, encouraged me to look back over the instructions of Cyprian that he has in his book and the exhortation, the exorcism at the start of his working book. He turns up looking like a mid 17th century dude. He enjoys his cider, his small beer, his gin. In terms of once we kind of like struck up a bit more of a rapport. Actually, rapport was easy. Getting him to stay on task and get things done with me did involve some like time out, some cooling off periods. It's one of the reasons I found a vessel to kind of give him his time out. Sometimes I got a stoppered Bellarmine jar, which has a face I can talk to, but also he likes to apparate out of it, very sort of cartoon genie like. But I also reduced a copy of his book to ash to work into powders and other preparations, as well as like a further bed for him to talk from his points of power and the things that anchored him in life. As he got more reliable and like fulfilled the jobs I was giving him and went above and beyond and but not in a way that's straight off task, I've given him other ingredients that he worked with heavily, like vervain, to do more work effectively. And has continued to prove a really useful spirit, a tutelary shade, often in talking about things that happened in his life and how he navigated it, often badly. So it's as much as don't do this. But yeah, that's a lot what looking like having a relationship with a dead cunning man has been like for me.
That's lovely. I think that's the main thing in proposing this, other than I get to take a break because I've read this grimoire in the context of like the various cunning man notebooks as well. But I also know that this is a spirit that you have worked with, and that is in addition to your expertise in the area of this time period, which contextualizes things. I have no idea that, I'm going to be a bad magician for a second. I have no idea the reality of anything we do.
Yeah.
I might propose that for many reasons, a 17th century magician might be more comfortable coming to someone who knows his context and time period better.
Yeah.
Some other people. And that is part of the great mystery of what we do, that if useful information comes, especially information that you would not have had access to otherwise,
Yeah.
or even just re-encouraging you, like, whoa, there's apparently a Buddhist thing going through today. But of like, outer demon is inner demon and outer God is inner God, of like,
Mm.
if these are all aspects of your mind doing this, wonderful. If our mind is one universal giant mind, then that might explain a lot too.
Mm.
But I find it really grounding and inspirational to see. Well, I mean, I love that we are practicing what we preach to begin with, but that the notion of someone who can explain their own works better, because so much of my own argument for living traditions and things like this, despite, the difficulties of like, oh, what? I have to join a community? Are you kidding me? Or form community. The idea that, most books, to borrow any of my previous rants of Rabelais, and like, they teach us to talk about things we have no idea of anything about,
Mm.
or just that all reading is an act of necromancy, and that, reanimating the clay of those words, you're forming an Adamic creation that you think is correct and true, and you are a little god in your world, reanimating the clay of these words into something that has meaning. And if you are not informed as to the nature of your own, what kind of god you are, you can create monsters, you can create abominations that have little resemblance to where their DNA is.
Yeah.
And it could be a recipe for disaster as well, to be like, well, I'm also in contact with the author.
Right. When do authors really not want to talk about their work, right?
Yeah.
Like how do you frame it in a way that's useful, right? I don't know, speaking personally, like I mean, I'm always grateful when people have read anything I've done, but I find myself getting a lot more animated and have for me more fruitful conversations with other like writers, with other people who are also doing the thing. The exchange of ideas of, like you said, doing stuff is different from just like, when you wrote this metaphor on page 36, what did you mean by that? Where did you get your ideas from? Right? Um,
Yeah. So what you're talking about too is the effective learning of how to ask clarifying questions, and what is it that you would speak to somebody about. So we've all had that experience on the lecture end, right? Of this is a statement, not a question, sir.
yeah.
And just the general, like, okay, that moving on. Because learning to ask the question, as in divination, and if we're talking about necromancy, the mancy part still holds true. Asking questions of the dead is still divination, and asking for the dead to teach you is still divination.
Yeah.
And therefore, if you do not know how to frame the question, you will not get the best answers.
Hmm.
And so I think there's something, again, there's I don't know how much to harp on it other than just going to Arthur Gauntlet to learn more about Arthur Gauntlet, but also to find out more about what's not on the page.
Yeah.
From that spirit. This is the wet dream of our magical ancestors, right? This is the everything from Excellent Book of Magic to like consult your future selves about being magicians,
Yep.
to those who are told they might attain rainbow body start consulting their praying to their future rainbow body itself to help them attain rainbow body.
Yeah.
And I think that's it's both wonderfully grounded and completely delusional at the same time. And
Yeah.
I think that speaks to a necessity of humor and community, right? Around safeguard, like necromantic communities tend to have far more safeguards in place than those who have removed themselves from community.
Yeah.
And far more sustainable in the long run of like, hey, are you okay? You're going a little off here.
Right.
Like I am. So um,
Yeah.
it's much easier to keep the flame of Letizia aloft if you have a team of people trying to keep the little flame aloft.
Heck yeah.
And so I guess there's something in that too of through all of this, through all that we do, what are the best practices that we can do so that we're not burning ourselves out, so that we're not going, because we've seen it. We've had clients and friends who have lost their sanity to various permutations of these paths.
Yeah.
And yet we still continue.
But
And
we're different. Better, one might say.
uh,
Our hubris
I am
is
certainly
unmatched.
not better. That's
No,
for
no,
sure.
no, me neither.
Um,
No,
uh,
I'm made better by the people around me that I can share the weird stuff with, and yeah, take some time out for myself as well as for for spirits. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
the streets. So I think that's I mean like we've gone through everything I believe.
Yeah.
It's an interesting thing to think of like all of this from the one thing I thought about with the chair of St. Peter is the armchair magician to bring it full circle. Of
So
like
yeah, on the one hand, you got the arm, yeah, definitely the armchair, the sitting there, thinking about it means doing it.
yeah.
That
And
just
in a
because
Catholic context that might be correct.
sure, sure, and there are
Sin in
many
thought is sin indeed.
many mystical and magical traditions where talking about it is part of the thing.
Yes.
That's and talking about it with a study buddy so that
In my
you
mind's eye and the nature of vision, right?
sure, yeah, absolutely. And what does it mean
Sure, sure,
to
sure, 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 sure.
yeah, yeah, what
Yeah.
does it mean to sit in the chair and be the one in the chair when someone comes in?
Or
Down
that
to
space, even that nature of like the dad chair that like no one's supposed to sit in except the one person who is like, at work when they come home and then that's their chair.
a Stammtisch. Yeah, yeah.
And then or
Your
like
seat at the
or
bar.
cats
Yeah.
have that too. Cats to dogs too. Like dogs
Hmm.
tend to be a little bit like they don't get nasty about it the same way. Where like the cat will take over the dog's bed and the dog's just like, friend, that's my bed. And the cat's like,
No, mine now. How dare you
yeah,
change the sheets? Yeah.
yeah. Oh God, you're Freya. You're terrible at that. Oh, terrifying.
She don't like it. No.
But yeah, I like this, the armchair of St. Peter as a thing that's important too, is that not just ex cathedra, but the joke of infallibility is
Mm,
really like I understand in creating rules that foment community. That I get. Guidelines of ethics and morals of like this is where we want to go collectively. This is our understanding, and we will wrestle against these to create the ball sack of our identity. But there's also this thing of like, oh, what I say goes, and you like leaders are part of their communities. They are not separate from. And if you isolate yourself from that because you are the cathedra, the, you have a tube up your penis or whatever. I'm going
the
metaphors here.
catheter of the cathedral. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Ex catheter. Just the importance of really emphasizing, communities are things we co-create
Mm,
and leaders are a part of their community, and that these rules that come down, if they serve the community, will last, and if they don't, if it's just points of dogma, I understand the point of clarity, but I also really love in so many examples of our oral traditions of it is okay if you fundamentally believe that that thing is blue and I say it's black, as long as we can assume if I can support you in that thing is blue and I will
mm.
bring blue things for when you do it and you will bring black things for when I do it. And like
Mm.
it does not need to be an absolute what it's funny because an open circle in mathematics is actually the closed one.
Mm.
But the idea that might makes right or one way or the highway type of mentality does not serve well in the end, and especially in magic,
No.
where we are constantly the trickster nature of ourselves, whether it's wolf or pimenta or Trimasael, like things are going to defy, the lizard that climbs the ledge that falls down to get back up again. And,
Mm.
there's always, if you miss the first hour at sunrise, you still have the eighth.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of things there that just using what you have and going back to the mentality of like pen, I name thee dragon's blood, or resin, I name thee Storax, which seems far more prevalent in the ancient world because you got to sell something.
Right.
Um, or not even in the ancient world, in the modern world. In all worlds, at all times.
Right.
Uh,
The perenniality of like, does this fly? Does it pay the rent? Does it keep you in the cider you'd like to become accustomed to?
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Something I think that's really wonderful. Something that also kind of stirs me is this idea of the chairs we lay out for ghosts. whether the Holy Spirit or a 17th century London sorcerer,
Yeah.
and the the chair for the dead.
Oh, the
Uh,
Elijah, the seat, which then brings to the point that I love that extended metaphor, right? The chair you put out for the dead. What is it that we borrow the terminology from our various Afro-diasporic traditions of seating something?
mhm,
Of this is a seat for the spirit, or that the priest themselves is a seat for the spirit.
yeah.
Um, that this is where the spirit's enthroned. We
Mhm,
talk about a throno in Orisha, right? Of this is the temporary. This is it. We're displaying it, and that has heavy influence. You can look into David Brown's Santeria Enthroned, where he's specifically looking at the inheritance of Cuba as colonial aesthetic and regalness that then gets merged with Yoruba aesthetic and it translating Yoruba shrines into Cuban Yoruba shrines
mm,
of what that does and that the enthronement and the seating of things.
yeah.
Something that is, I mean, in Nahuatl, there's this concept of toothed. A lot of place glyphs and have teeth in it, or even the word might have tooth because something that is established in a place is like a tooth in the jaw.
Mm,
It can be eradicated, but it's firm like a tooth in the jaw. And
mm.
people may choose otherwise, but to have something be placed is to have it be toothed. Um,
It can take the pressure to turn things into nutrients.
yeah.
Huh.
So and then that brings me back to the wolf tooth and the
Yeah.
nature of these things and the ravenous hunger that is there and the lack of teeth in a goat's mouth, but still goddamn they hurt when they bite you. Um, especially, they're just curious little buggers, and all of a sudden your like finger is like, oh dear God. So yeah, I suppose that's it for this episode, right? We've
Yeah.
done a pretty lovely roundup. Thank you, dear listener, for having gotten this far to um, the the grue of our existence. Episode 44, Chair of St. Peter, all the way down to, or the armchair of St. Peter, down to Arthur Gauntlet and his what was it? What's her profession?
Speculatrix.
Speculatrix.
Sarah,
I
yeah.
was going to say Sycorax, and that's a different thing. Speculatrix, yes. Make Speculatrix great again. Uh,
Hmm.
but it's been a pleasure, Al, and
Absolutely, Jesse. Yeah, absolutely.
thank you so much, everyone. You can find us sometimes, if you blink fast enough. Um,
When the moon hits a wolf's eye, like
yeah.
a tiny pizza pie. Uh,
Gross. Gluten-free pizza is terrible. But yes, we are on the webs at radiofreegolgotha.com. We are on the Patreon. Search us as Radio Free Golgotha. We are there. We are continuing to add content there. We disclosed last month's footnotes, so you can see how detailed, and there's a lot of research in there. And we'll continue with the footnotes for this one will be for patrons, and continue to play with things there and build community there. And thank you so much for your support, those that are there.
yeah, thank you.
We're also on the Facebook.
Yeah,
Uh,
Lieberface. Yeah, the
yeah,
folk necromancy group is there and keeping that updated with some fascinating stuff. Thanks to Ben for also being a moderator on that and getting into
yes.
all sorts of fascinating Tibetan stuff and all sorts of other things.
You can find Al and his appearances and classes at alexandercummins.com.
Hmm.
And you can find me avoiding life at jessehathawaydiaz.com. What else? We will continue to try to update our talks and things on the Radio Free Golgotha site, as well as if you are interested in the speakeasies, which are kind of our mini conferences that we do. We're hoping to do one in the next couple of months, and we'll be announcing that soon.
Hmm.
And it's also something that patrons will have access to if they're at certain tiers, guaranteed. But otherwise, we raise money for charity,
Hmm.
and go from there. So I think that's it. Have a break, have a breath, have a Kit Kat. I don't know. Um, have a wolf's fart, which is a type of mushroom.
Really?
Yes, it is a puffball. They call it wolf's farts in some areas. Um, so yeah, don't get sentenced to the mines in Spain. uh,
No.
or Serbia. And yeah, something. There was inspiration a few minutes ago. That muse has sailed on. She was like, so thank you everyone. It's been lovely as always, Al, and long live the fighters.
Mhm.
Yeah, awesome. Happy
Nice.
feast. Wow, we're going there. Happy feast of Saint Peter's Chair.
Happy
Where
feast,
that
everyone.
accent's from, but Al's is real, mine is not. All right.
Take care,
Bye-bye.
everyone.